Chapter 254. The battle at the peak was completely different from the battle at the foot of the mountain, as well as the running between the mountains. Both the purple sea mecha and little white flower no longer made any movements of flying. Instead, they clung to the ground with their mechanical legs, relying entirely on the movements of the mecha's upper body to fight. The honest here naturally meant that they had slowed down their speed by many times before they could sense it. In reality, the two MX mecha were like willow tree monsters, rooted deeply in the soil, not a trace of disorder in the slightest. Every step they took seemed so solid, but the movements of the upper half of the mecha were like willow branches dancing wildly in the wind, fast, dangerous, and terrifyingly precise. This scene gave the spectators the illusion that the mechanical legs of the two MX mecha in overclocking did not seem to move at all. Instead, it was only the ground beneath the mecha that moved. The godlike purple sea mecha twisted its body, and the sharp tri-edged armor-piercing thorn slid along the surface of little white flower's already broken alloy mecha. The huge tri-edged thorn, nearly 1 meter long, was like a fireworks stick in the hands of a child. The tip of the thorn brought out a shocking spark. In the midst of the silent battle, the sawtooth blade on the right mechanical arm of the white mech silently sliced across from under the arm, leaving a shallow cut on the wrist of the purple sea mech. But at least it stopped the purple sea mech from delivering a fatal stab. The loud roar of the twin engines did not have air as a medium to announce its power, but it caused the body of the mecha to tremble. Under the effect of the peak power, the purple sea mecha retracted its mechanical leg, and like a gust of wind, it forced its way into the midsection of little white flower's mecha, its shoulder slamming into the midsection of the cockpit. For a moment, broken pieces of the shock-absorbing armor flew everywhere. A chilling distortion slowly appeared, and the white mecha slumped, about to fall. 147. Sulu ignored the bloodstains on his chest, silently counting down in his heart. The weight of high speed was already a heavy enough burden for a pilot. After entering overclocking mode, little white flower's mecha could no longer provide a complete shock-absorbing and life support system like before when it faced the violent attack of the purple sea head-on. The tremendous impact caused his iron-like body to feel sore and painful, as if it was about to fall apart. Sulu didn't know how many mouthfuls of blood he had spat out. His face was a little pale as he stared at the holographic screen in his helmet. His hands moved quickly, and the joysticks made cracking sounds as if they were about to break. Every inch of his skin was burning as he sent instructions to the simulation system, controlling little white flower to block purple sea's fierce thrust, but it was unable to block purple sea's powerful strike. As the surface of the mech changed shape, Suli's vision turned black for a moment from the tremendous force. From the warning data of the onboard computer, he knew that little white flower had lost its balance. With a muffled grunt, Suli's body, which was wrapped in the simulation system, began to tremble rapidly. Countless complex commands were transmitted to every component of the mecha. The thick and heavy mechanical legs began to tremble and slide. They began to move in a semi-closed arc around a certain fixed point. The high-speed hydraulic pipelines and transmission devices in the armor pressed, stretched, and returned to their original positions at a speed that could not be seen with the naked eye. During this process, the terrifying impact of the purple sea's mecha was gradually dispelled. Little white flower's mecha looked like it was on the brink of death, but in the end, it stood proudly at the end of the 2 deep trenches. Can't fall. Sulu flicked the 5 fingers of his right hand. Cooperating with the simulation system, he controlled little white flower's mecha to stick close to the platform on the peak, and charge towards the purple sea once more. After entering overclocking mode, both Sulu and Madman Li no longer used the fierce leaping attack moves they had done at the foot of the mountain. Instead, with great tacit understanding, they had their mecha cling tightly to the weathered rocks on the peak as they advanced. Their horizontal movement speed increased slightly, but neither attempted to attack from the air. Overclocking battle was an extremely risky battle mode. From the very beginning, Sulu had acted on instinct and operated his mecha according to the 10 stances Uncle Feng Yu had taught him. He was not willing to let little white flower leave the ground for even a microsecond. Those 10 mysterious and strange stances were all powerful body techniques that allowed one to stand tall on the ground and remain as still as a pine tree. He did not quite understand why the purple sea's mecha would also choose this type of battle mode. Could it be that Uncle Feng was really related to the Lees of Philadelphia in some way? Sulu could vaguely grasp the Purple Sea's mecha's battle style and attack patterns. Linking it to that night in Linyuan, he even had a feeling that the 10 stances Uncle Feng had taught him seemed to be some kind of secret technique to counter the Lees of Philadelphia. However, Madman Li was still Madman Li after all. It was no wonder he was known as the invincible fighter in the military. It was no wonder he was the super strong fighter who had continuously hunted down the Empire's Royal Mecha Battalion for more than 3 years. Even if Sulu used the simulation system to control his mecha, which was equivalent to the hand speed of a military ace pilot, and even if he could vaguely guess the attack rhythm and direction of the Purple Sea's mecha, he could not find any chance to retaliate in front of the purple torrent that filled the peak of the mountain. Previously, at the foot of the mountain, the Purple Sea's mecha had displayed mobility and crazy attack ability in Madman Li's hands, had already made Sulu feel that it was difficult to withstand. However, after entering overclocking mode, the Purple Sea's mecha became even more terrifying in close combat. Firstly, the super performance of the Purple Sea after overclocking was fully displayed. Secondly, Li Feng, who was controlling the Purple Sea, seemed to really be a little crazy. In the vision of Su Li's helmet, on the holographic screen of the old moon base and the ground command hall, everyone seemed to vaguely see a roaring purple spotted tiger. It was currently charging towards the platform on the peak of the Khaki Peak on the moon's polar region, towards the white mecha that refused to admit defeat no matter what. It was launching its final bite. The white mecha flashed and dodged at high speed. Time and time again in contact, collision, sword light and shadow of punches, the white mecha was knocked back and injured. Inside the mecha, Sulu kept staring with his pair of small eyes, silently counting down in his heart, 132,131. At this moment Sulu, who was inside the little white flower mecha, was not squinting his eyes like before. Instead, he was staring with wide eyes at the Purple Sea mecha in his vision. In the Purple Sea, Li Feng, on the other hand, was skillfully operating the mecha, launching wave after wave of powerful attacks. At the same time, he was squinting his eyes to size up the white mecha that was in a terrible state. Its performance had dropped drastically, but it still refused to admit defeat. For this young genius pilot from the Federation, mecha battles had long become a part of his life. It was an exciting factor in his blood. This kind of intense battle should not have made him enter such a violent and wild state. However, that despicable person in the white mecha unexpectedly made him develop such a strong desire to battle. Li Feng admitted that Sulu had surprised him. Not only did Sulu personally operate the mecha to battle with him, but also the standard that Sulu had displayed in this battle. This was already close to the standard of an ace pilot in the army. Moreover, he knew that Sulu was the technician who had developed the Nutshell MX, so in terms of operating the new MX, he had a great advantage. However, he still did not think that Sulu would be able to defeat him. This was a kind of pride and confidence that was deeply rooted in his bones. The Purple Sea's excellent maneuverability perfectly displayed the standard of his mecha operation. The Purple Sea's current ferocious attacks were like a raging river. In fact, he could do it with his eyes closed. When Li Feng was still a baby and had just opened his eyes, that grandfather of his had carried him into the mecha. Not long after he had learned how to walk, his grandfather had started to let him try to climb the ladder beside the tall mecha. Other than his grandfather, the first word that Li Feng had learned was mecha. Before he had learned how to drive a car, he had already learned how to operate a mecha. Before he had time to like girls such as Yuzi, he had already fallen in love with the feeling of operating a mecha. When all the youths in the Federation were still looking at the teaching screens and imagining the mecha levels in online games, the 12-year-old Li Feng had already been sent to the front lines of the Westwoods by his grandfather. He had passed the unprecedented military test and obtained his first real military mecha. Then, he had begun to operate the M52 on the mineral planets on the pirate ships. He had learned how to slaughter, and had gotten used to smashing the enemy's mecha into a pile of scrap metal. In the short 16 years of Madman Li's life, he had always been closely associated with the term mecha, never separating from it. Sometimes he even felt that every time he stayed in the stuffy and quiet cockpit, he was his true self. Invincible in the military Madman Li. These were all adjectives he had gotten from operating a mecha. This was because the moment he entered a mecha, he would be even wilder and more violent than usual. This was because he was even stronger in a mecha. Thus, Li Feng could not understand why Sulu had been able to hold on for so long. Why did he not admit defeat even though he knew that defeat was certain and could only be worse? Thinking of that bet, and the white mecha's persistence at this moment, Madman Li's eyes narrowed even more. A hint of anger flashed through his reddish eyes. The purple sea mecha attacked fiercely once again, ravaging the little white flower over and over again. There was no such thing as mutual appreciation. The pale-faced Sulu stared with wide eyes amidst the intense tremors. He stared at that purple sea which was like a mad tiger, controlling his mecha to avoid those fatal points of attack as he mumbled softly to himself, "Fuck you, fuck you." His voice was so gentle, so calm that even he himself felt that he was still calm. He did not feel the intimidating power and aura displayed by the purple sea mecha before him. However, his rationality told him that whether it was in terms of mecha operation accuracy, battle experience, or any of the qualities and abilities required to operate a mecha, Li Feng was far above him in all aspects. If this had not been a secret military test match, Sulu knew that Madman Li would definitely not mind killing him after defeating him. Thus, there was no such thing as mutual appreciation. He only stared coldly, wanting to see how the other would die. The countdown in his heart had already reached 1,117 seconds. 1 minute had passed, so there were still more than 2 minutes left. Sulu did not know if he could hold on for more than 2 minutes. He did not know if the little white flower's mecha would explode prematurely. After entering overclocking, the battle was even more one-sided. The white mecha was in an extremely wretched state, looking like it could explode at any moment. However, Sulu had no intention of surrendering. He only made each of his operations more precise, each of his dodges faster, each of his attacks fiercer. On the quiet platform of Kaki Peak, the purple sea mech was like an invincible god, while the white mech was like a trembling little white flower. Occasionally, it would be blown away by the wind or crushed by the giant's feet. There were several parts of the mech's body that were bent out of shape. Liquid leaked out and the central control system was damaged. It could collapse at any moment. But it did not collapse. The people in the ground command hall watched the images on the screen in silence. The neutral military mechanics and engineers watched this scene quietly. A sense of respect for the successor of the military god grew in their hearts, as well as respect for the nutshell mecha operator. On the other hand, the staff in the nutshell area were clenching their fists nervously. Looking at the tragic sight of the little white flower on the screen, all of them had the urge to admit defeat. Shangqiu's eyes had already turned into the moon's. She stared blankly at the screen. She knew that the little white flower's mecha was not willing to admit defeat. It was persevering, wanting to hold on until that moment arrived. But the problem was, looking at the data being fed back at this moment, the little white flower's mecha would not be able to hold on until that moment. It would be in danger of exploding. As the technical supervisor of the Nutshell Engineering Department, she did not have the authority to stop this test. But subtly, she suddenly really hoped that Sulu would admit defeat, because this way, at least he would be able to preserve his own life. There was nervousness, there was respect, and naturally there were other emotions as well. Not everyone would cast a respectful gaze towards a persevering loser. The professors and experts from the Federal Academy of Science were already smiling calmly and confidently as they watched the screen at the top of Kaki Peak. From their perspective, the standards of the Federation's new MX mecha would definitely be the glory that belonged to them. On the viewing platform, Dean Lin Yuanhu no longer leaned forward. He stroked the white hair at the corner of his forehead and sat back down in his chair. Turning his head, he whispered a few words to the National Security Advisor beside him. There were not many people in the old moon base who had the authority to watch this mecha test battle, but there were still more than 100 people. They were all soldiers of the Federation, so naturally, they would stand on the side of the heir of the military god who was operating the Purple Sea mecha. Just like the people from the Academy of Science in the ground command hall, they too had relaxed smiles on their faces. It was just that the people in the military base were more direct in their reactions. Some of them began to cheer, while others even began to count. These military officers thought back to the bet that the technical supervisor of Nutshell had made with Lieutenant Colonel Li Feng 2 days ago. They thought back to the young man's disrespect towards the military god of Philadelphia. Right now, watching the Purple Sea mecha tormenting the little white flower in a frenzy, their emotions were stirred to the extreme. 1, 2, 3. They were counting. How many more seconds would it take for the purple sea mecha to defeat that white mecha? They were even wondering if they should immediately go and drag the technical supervisor of Nutshell out so that he could fulfill his end of the bet and kneel down before the Lees of Philadelphia. Chapter 255. Looks like your Shell Motor Company is indeed not popular. The MX mecha will be allocated to soldiers in the future, but look at the attitude of the military. They are clearly only willing to accept the Purple Sea. What are you all fighting for? In a room on the second floor of the Old Moon Base's observation hall, the official from the Constitutional Bureau rubbed his throbbing abdomen as he looked at Bai Yulan, who had her head lowered in silence, and sneered. He didn't know that those soldiers were so fanatically supporting the Federal Academy of Sciences Purple Sea mecha because of the Lees of Philadelphia. The soldiers in the base had followed the request of the Bureau of Proclamation. After arresting Bai Yulan, they had actually kept him locked up in the base. This matter involved the Federation's MX mecha test. No matter how detached the Bureau of Proclamation was from the political structure of the Federation, they couldn't immediately do anything to Bai Yulan. Besides, there were still many things hidden behind this matter. Since that official had already fulfilled the request of some power and kept the pilot that Nutshell had originally arranged to stay, he naturally didn't want to cause any more trouble. Bai Yulan slowly raised his head and quietly looked through the glass door of the room at the breathtaking MX mecha battle on the screen. He was silent for a long time. He thought to himself that if he was the one controlling Little White Flower now, he might have been able to complete it better than Sulu in the beginning. However, right now, under the violent attacks of the Purple Sea, he definitely wouldn't be willing to hold on like this. 8. 9. What are you saying? The official from the Bureau of Proclamation looked at him coldly. Bai Yulan turned his head and said softly, I'm counting. How long will it take for the Purple Sea mecha from the Academy of Science to explode? He paused for a moment, then continued softly, now it seems that I really have to thank you for locking me up. Otherwise, how could that guy be angry enough to personally go into battle? The face of the official from the Bureau of Proclamation darkened slightly. He didn't say anything else. He turned his head to look at the MX battle that he was also very interested in. He thought to himself that this delicate man was probably mad to the point of insanity. Otherwise, why would he say such a thing? Some people participated in the Federation's extreme long-distance race, but in the end, their legs were crippled and their bodies were exhausted. However, they still stubbornly shook off the hands of the medical staff and limped towards the finish line, ignoring whether there were still spectators around them. Sulu respected these men with sportsmanship, but he would not do that. He didn't want to cause trouble, wasn't afraid of trouble, and didn't want to attract attention. But if he was running on the track and people in the same race tried to trip him or use tricks, then he would keep running until he overtook them and won the championship. Then he would turn around coldly, look at those people, ask why, reason with them, and fight for his dignity. This guy was not afraid when someone pointed a cold gun at his head in the Donglin district. He was only angry. When he encountered an iron fist, he did not cower. Instead, he bravely escaped. He did not leave timidly. Instead, he went to find Fengyu. This guy was not afraid when he saw the black mecha in the underground parking lot. Instead, he kicked it fiercely. When he was bullied by important people, he did not back down. Instead, he stood up bravely. He did not use the data to try to get anything. Instead, he stood there silently, waiting for reason and fairness. He stood there until now. The Little White Flower's mecha was in a sorry state. It was miserable. It could explode at any time, but he refused to admit defeat. Perhaps even he himself did not understand when this stubbornness, which seemed to have faded from his life as a young miner, had returned to his body. He did not think of Uncle Fengyu. He did not think of the innocent waitresses who died in the Linhai State Stadium. He did not think of Zhang Xiaoming who died in a political conspiracy. He did not think of Shi Qinghai who was betrayed and disappeared. He did not think of Professor Shen in the Galaxy Public Cemetery. He did not think of the old professor's hard work in the experiment data. He did not think of the officer surnamed Park on Hushan Road. He did not think of the broken bodies at the concert in Huanshan Mountain. He did not think of the independent director in the rainy night. He did not think of Magnolia who was arrested by the Bureau of Proclamation 2 days ago, because there was no need to think of these. They were all buried deep in his mind. From Donglin to S1, the unfairness, darkness, and conspiracy of the Federation had always been there. Sulu often thought of the letter Shi Qinghai left for him before he left. In the face of social injustice, some people wanted to be the ones to inflict it. Some people silently accepted it. Some people wanted to change something. Those without power would shout on the internet, using silence to express their anger. And what should those with power do? MX Mecca, the Academy of Science, Politics, the election. Sulu had already unconsciously become a person with power. He could change something, so he told himself that he must persevere. Each time the little white flower suffered a heavy blow, it was like a sledgehammer striking a rock. This rock persevered, but who knew whether the rock would shatter in the end? Or the sledgehammer would shatter? Or would the people in the Federation who wielded the sledgehammer be afraid and tired? Sulu stared with red eyes at the crazed silhouette of the purple sea mecha in his field of vision, but he was unusually calm as he carried out his own operations. The little white flower mecha could not hold on for much longer, but he was becoming more and more familiar with the controls, feeling stronger and stronger. Those 10 poses that Uncle Feng Yu had taught him back then were all perfectly executed by him using the little white flower mecha. His eyes were red. Naturally, it was not because he was moved or sad, but because there was fire, a very big fire. Sulu stared at that terrifying purple sea mecha, thinking of that arrogant and unreasonable person inside the mecha. When we first met at Linyuan, you wanted to kill me. When we met at the hospital, you said you wanted to kill me again. Today, when we met again at the peak of Old Moon Peak, you still wanted to kill me. Although you have never really killed me, what right do you have to say this so calmly? You are the only grandson of the Federation's military god. You are a rare genius pilot. You joined the army at the age of 12 to kill the enemy, and you have already become a legend. So you want to proudly say that one day you will kill me? I won't accept it. I won't accept it. I won't accept it. I won't accept it. I have already killed when I was 10. Today I want to beat you up and then make you call me uncle. 98. 97. 63, 61, 38, 37, Sulu and Shangqiu had repeatedly calculated many times. The electronic jets that the purple sea mecha had designed based on that deviated functional model could only last for 3 minutes because the dual-engine mecha needed to adjust its posture while in overclocking mode. In the past, in his mind, 3 minutes was a very short amount of time. But today, he found that these 180 seconds were actually as long as space travel and unbearable. There were still 37 seconds left, but the little white flower mecha was already at its most dangerous edge. Sulu silently operated his mecha to make an attack motion, but he knew that even if he did not accept it, he was going to lose today. However, right at this moment, the purple sea mecha, which had been as crazy as a drunken tiger, with an overwhelming presence, and had the absolute advantage all this while, suddenly seemed somewhat uncoordinated as it executed a standard left-spinning sideways attack motion. In the next instant, the purple sea mecha's beautiful back armor vibrated. On the giant holographic screen in the ground command hall, many of the technical parameters belonging to Mecha Number 1 were performing perfectly. Even in overclocking mode, they were still very stable. In contrast, on the other side, Mecha Number 2's technical parameters were already somewhat horrible to look at. No one knew how that nutshell pilot could still operate a mecha that was about to be scrapped. However, right at this moment, the light beam representing the most important power output indicator of Mecha Number 1 abruptly stopped moving up and down within the normal range, coming to a standstill at a certain level. Then the power output light beam fell abruptly, rushing towards its original position. The red light beam fell abruptly. It looked like blood loss. It was a ghastly sight. No one in the entire command hall could react. Even Nutshell and the other engineers could only stare blankly at the holographic screen, thinking that their eyes were playing tricks on them. However, Shangqiu, who had been nervous for a long time, reacted faster than anyone else. She raised her right hand high into the air and clenched it into a fist. In her fist was a pen. She shouted excitedly, "Fuck!" The profanity of this genius female engineer woke up many people in the command hall. As if someone was commanding them, the engineers, experts, and professors of the 3 factions all let out cries of surprise at the same time. Combined together, it was like a giant wave, flooding the entire command hall. In the stands, Lin Yuanhu, who had been quietly chatting with the National Security Advisor, had not looked at the monotonous and one-sided battle on the holographic screen in order to show his confidence to the people of the Federation. He indeed had absolute confidence in both Purple Sea and Madman Li, especially after overclocking mode. So when he heard the cries of surprise, he could not help but be a little surprised. Dean Lin Yuanhu turned his head and saw that the power output indicator on the holographic screen had already fallen to 0. He stood up abruptly, his aged lips becoming incomparably pale. His body swayed twice. He clutched his left chest, as if he could collapse at any moment. The soldiers in the old moon base had already counted to 70. They thought that Purple Sea's mecha was already in the bag, and that perhaps the nutshell white mecha would explode in the next moment. Bai Yulan had already stood up and was standing behind the door. She looked at the holographic screen with slight anxiety. She had already counted to 37 seconds, but it seemed that she could no longer see the possibility of what would happen next. Right at this moment, the sound of the old moon base counting suddenly stopped abruptly. Everyone looked at the holographic screen in confusion. They did not understand why the Purple Sea mecha's originally incomparably sharp left-turn footwork had become somewhat sluggish. Moreover, the sluggishness was a little too much. It's probably the image being delayed, some people thought in their hearts. Maybe he wants to leave the nutshell mecha to play with for a while longer? Some people thought of Lieutenant Colonel Li Feng's movements. What happened next made the speculations of all the old moon base officers become a joke. On the platform at the peak of Mount Kaki, the Purple Sea mecha had not even finished its sluggish left-turn footwork when the struggling white mecha suddenly moved violently. This naturally could not be the result of the image being delayed. In the moment when the Purple Sea mecha was on the brink of dissatisfaction and struggle, every abnormality in its movements was like a provocative signal that entered Su Li's brain through his eyes. However, in the previous long period of time, Madman Li had controlled the Purple Sea mecha with a sense of indifference in its madness. There had been no loopholes that could be exploited. However, at this moment, the beautiful left-turn footwork of the Purple Sea mecha had a problem. For Su Lu, who had been waiting bitterly for more than 100 seconds, this anomaly undoubtedly represented his best chance. Although he did not understand why the Purple Sea mecha's problem had occurred 37 seconds earlier than he had predicted, he knew that he had to grab hold of this opportunity. In reality, Su Lu needed to exert any kind of mental pressure on himself to make the final explosive strike. This was because, like a spring that had been suppressed for a long time, if it did not lose its elasticity due to metal fatigue and adhesion, once it got the chance it would definitely rebound strongly. Or like a drowning person, once they grabbed hold of something by their side, they would definitely not let go. Through this series of brutal blows, Su Lu had gradually come to understand how to use the simulation system to replicate the 10 poses that the uncle had taught him with his mecha. However, Little White Flower's mecha was severely damaged, and Crazy Li was putting too much pressure on him. His attacks were too ferocious, so there was no chance for him to put it into practice. At this time, the Purple Sea mecha suddenly changed. The heavy pressure on Mount Kaki loosened, and Little White Flower's mecha, which had been teetering on the brink of collapse, suddenly displayed absolute speed. It turned into a flowing shadow, evading the triangular alloy spike on the right mechanical arm of the Purple Sea mecha. The white mecha's thick mechanical legs seemed to be trembling, but in reality it was moving quickly, sticking close to the ground. In an instant, it twisted its body to stand face to face with the Purple Sea mecha. The serrated blade at the front of the mechanical arm chopped down viciously at the neck of the Purple Sea mecha, sending sparks flying. Immediately after that, Little White Flower's mecha swaggered up, charging straight for the middle of the Purple Sea mecha's abdomen. At the same time, its left mechanical arm wrapped around the Purple Sea mecha's head, and the battered Little White Flower lowered its head, slamming viciously into the assembled armor beside the Purple Sea mecha's cockpit. Sparks flew everywhere, smoke and dust flew everywhere. The white light was blinding, and the mecha warped and twisted. There was mist and blood-like liquid leaking out. Little White Flower's mecha and the Purple Sea mecha continued to maintain this stance. In today's MX battle, Madman Li's Purple Sea mecha had been extremely domineering. However, Su Li's Little White Flower mecha had been able to push its performance to the limits despite being at an extreme disadvantage. The situation had looked tragic, but it had successfully evaded most of the fatal attacks, which was why Little White Flower had been able to hold on until the very last moment. However, at this time, Little White Flower's sudden burst of 3 consecutive attacks had truly hit the Purple Sea's vital points. Whether it was the connecting part of the mecha's skull or the assembled armor beside the cockpit, after suffering such heavy damage, how could it still stand? Chapter 256. Little White Flower's final 3 consecutive attacks looked simple, but in reality, it was the most perfect attack that Sulu could execute while operating the damaged mecha. Each of Little White Flower's seemingly normal attacks were in fact continuous, avoiding Purple Sea's attacks after losing power and still relying on inertia to maintain high speed, successfully dealing heavy damage to the opponent. This was a combination of 3 of the 10 stances that Feng Yu had taught Sulu, and it was executed by Little White Flower's mecha in an instant. The high-speed chain blade at the front of the mechanical arm was pulled out of Purple Sea's mecha, leaving behind a trail of sparks as it drew a tragic wound. This action was very fast, but it looked exceptionally slow. Having lost power, Purple Sea's mecha seemed to have no power left to fight back, but Little White Flower did not stop there. The mecha moved at high speed, and within a second, it turned into countless white lines on the peak of Cocky Peak, continuously attacking Purple Sea. The tips of those white lines were dyed black, appearing dark and sinister. The countless lines converged on the body of Purple Sea's mecha, finally converging into a single point, and violently releasing a burst of power. This scene fell into the eyes of the people watching the battle in the command hall of the Old Moon base. They all felt their scalps go numb. This was a military test battle, and the nutshell operator controlling Little White Flower's mecha actually did not stop, as if he was hell-bent on destroying the opponent's mecha. This method was a little too ruthless. The peak of Cocky Peak trembled. The vacuum space that had been silent for hundreds of millions of years seemed to be about to be distorted by Little White Flower's final ruthless attacks. Little White Flower's mecha was like a cold-blooded monster, continuously executing high-speed attack moves. That was because Sulu, who was operating the mecha, knew very well what kind of monster Madman Li was in Purple Sea. Moreover, Purple Sea's twin engines had exploded more than 10 seconds earlier than expected. What was the reason for this? He needed to coldly and completely defeat Purple Sea, not giving the opponent any chance to escape. This was only the calculations of the silent engineer, but on the screen, Little White Flower appeared very ferocious at this moment. Following the final inertia of the Purple Sea mecha, the sharp and hard alloy stiletto about 1 meter long stabbed viciously into the left mechanical leg of the Little White Flower mecha with the last bit of power remaining in the micro-engine channels of the various joints. The heavily injured Little White Flower's left mechanical arm snapped like a spring that had been suppressed for too long. Finally, it could no longer withstand anything. This was Purple Sea's final attack that Sulu had always been wary of. Little White Flower's mecha's high-speed fang blade stabbed over viciously. Just like the disciples of the pugilistic world who had thrown themselves into the shadows of the city's forest, without thinking twice, the blade broke through the armor and stabbed deeply in. Then there was true silence. Little White Flower's mecha's left mechanical leg splashed with sparks. Liquid sprayed onto the white mountaintop rocks, unable to support the heavy body of the mecha anymore. It looked like a crippled warrior, only able to rely on the front end of the mechanical arm for support. 2 meters in front of him, Purple Sea's mecha suddenly shuddered, and then fell to the ground like a puppet whose strings had been cut. In the last moment, the powerful Lieutenant Colonel Li Feng had still managed to remove one of Little White Flower's left mechanical legs, but Little White Flower had damaged Purple Sea's entire system. Right now, Purple Sea's dual-core engines had already exploded, and the power of the joint micro-engines had dissipated. It was already a dead object. Watching the other build a mecha that was as tall as a building, watching this mecha collapse, right under the smoke and dust of Cocky Peak. In the stuffy cockpit, Sulu slowly pushed off his helmet. He breathed heavily and hurriedly, wiping away the blood at the corner of his mouth, looking at Purple Sea's mecha that was like a pile of scrap metal not too far away. He knew that the opponent no longer had any combat power. Only then did he truly relax and not continue to pursue. A faint trace of excitement and frustration welled up in his heart, but Sulu did not feel the slightest bit of pride. He narrowed his eyes and stared blankly at Purple Sea's mecha on the ground, endless exhaustion welling up in his heart. Madman Li had not been defeated by him. It was just that Purple Sea had been defeated by Little White Flower. As a pilot, he did not have any sense of accomplishment with which to boast about himself. The onboard computer of Little White Flower's mecha began to sound an alarm. The assembly system was already on the verge of collapse. The gravity of the old moon was much smaller than that of the S1 mecha, but the previously incomparably powerful and seemingly invincible Purple Sea's mecha collapsed with a crash into the weathered rocks, shaking up a cloud of dust on the ground. It appeared exceptionally heavy. Everyone who saw this scene felt as if their hearts had been ruthlessly smashed by a heavy stone. Purple Sea's mecha collapsed on the mountaintop. In the cockpit, Li Feng slowly pushed off his helmet and then lay motionless on his back. Through the visual system, he looked at the starry sky above his head. For a very long time he did not speak or move. He only remained silent. Purple Sea's mecha had been continuously damaged in the end. Its engine had exploded, and it was already a pile of trash. The last life support system was also beginning to gradually lose its function. Danger was approaching, but Madman Li did not seem to care at all. In the previous battle, Purple Sea had always held the advantage in terms of attack. His body had not suffered any injuries. A strange expression flashed across that delicate face. His thin lips moved slightly, and he muttered to himself, "Fuck?" The sound of counting in the old moon base came to an abrupt halt the moment Purple Sea's mecha had a problem. The scene that had happened in reality made those Federation soldiers who were proud of Philadelphia's military god feel incredulous. The people in the hall stared at the holographic screen. Seeing Little White Flower's last series of vicious attacks, their expressions were abnormally shocked. When the last purple mecha suddenly and decisively fell to the ground, while Little White Flower's mecha was still dragging a broken mechanical leg and barely standing up, the old moon base became even quieter, a deathly silence. Then, almost at the same time, there was a burst of exclamations and curses. "Fuck." In the room upstairs, Magnolia shook her head. She glanced at the extremely ugly expression of the Bureau of Proclamation official beside her. The fist in her pocket clenched tightly, and she let out a muffled breath. The ground command hall was even more lively. No one could accept this result in a short time, including the expert engineers from the Nutshell Engineering Department. Purple Sea's mecha from the Academy of Science was clearly about to obtain a decisive victory, but in the end, it had exploded. In the previous parameter curves, there were no signs of danger at all. What was going on? Fuck. Although the technicians from the Nutshell Engineering Department couldn't understand, seeing their company's Little White Flower obtain the final victory, they were already jumping up and down in excitement. They clapped and cheered with each other, using vulgarities to vent their excitement and nervousness. Shangqiu was one of the few people who could foresee today's situation. When the Purple Sea's power output had abruptly decreased, she had already involuntarily cursed. Now, however, she was able to stabilize her emotions. A happy smile appeared on her clean face. Although she knew from the very beginning that the Purple Sea mecha was the biggest hidden danger, Madman Li's suppressive fighting style had successfully dealt a heavy blow to Little White Flower. She had been worried for so long, and now she could finally relax. Subconsciously, Shangqiu turned around to look. She wanted to see the expressions of the professors from the Academy of Science and Director Lin Yuanhu. Although the mechanics and engineers of the Federal Military General Assembly Base were also abnormally surprised that the successor of the war god would lose this battle, they still woke up a little faster than the two parties involved. They had already begun the follow-up procedures. They were just thinking in their hearts. The excellent performance of the Purple Sea mecha had actually been destroyed in the last second. What was the reason? The professors and experts of the Federal Academy of Science were looking at the screen with desolate expressions. They looked at the two mecha that had already entered the recycling procedures. They had put in a lot of blood, sweat, and tears for that purple MX. Now they could only watch helplessly as it was defeated. No one could understand why the engine had malfunctioned. That kind of feeling of defeat mixed with the confusion of the unknown made their expressions incomparably gloomy. Shangqiu looked at these images, and a sweet and satisfied smile bloomed on her lips. However, she immediately noticed that Director Lin Yuanhu, who had originally been stunned, had now calmly returned to his seat. Her heart couldn't help but skip a beat. The important figures of the Federation government and military in the stands were all shocked by the sudden turn of events at the peak of Kaki Mountain. They all stood up, hands on the railings in front of them, and looked at the screen in shock. Occasionally, they would lower their heads and whisper something to the people around them. Just as they were about to sit down, the sound of footsteps came from the entrance of the command hall. The president of the Federation, Mr. Sieg, had finally finished an important meeting and hurried over. However, the battle was already over. Everyone stood up and saluted the president. Shang Qiu, however, noticed Supervisor Jose, who had walked in with the president. She narrowed her eyes. She couldn't help but feel that there was some hidden meaning in Supervisor Jose's gaze. The battle at the peak of Kaki Mountain had already ended. The Federation's near-space fleet was currently completing the recovery procedures. The images on the giant holographic screen had already been replaced by a continuous flow of various technical data comparisons. The soldiers at the old moon base who had watched the battle had already left, cursing and swearing. The two pilots who had personally participated in the battle were currently receiving treatment. Meanwhile, there was still a lot of work to be done in the ground command hall. These tasks were even more important than the battle itself. While the preparation procedures for the data calibration were being carried out, the command hall was temporarily much quieter. Many people began to rest, drinking coffee, and trying to soothe their previously tense emotions. In a small conference room at the side of the command hall, President Sieg sat in the middle seat. He lowered his head and looked at the battle report presented by his subordinates. He hadn't made a final decision regarding the battle test and the Federation's new mecha standards. Using the battle method, which was too direct, so much so that it was almost like child's play, to determine the Federation's new MX mecha standards was a suggestion made by that old man in Philadelphia. That old man could basically influence the attitude of the entire federal military. Therefore, logically speaking, the results of the battle at the peak of Kaki Mountain should be able to determine who the standards belong to. However, it was clear that some people weren't willing to admit their failure. All the technical parameters show that the Purple Sea mecha developed by the Federal Academy of Science has an incomparable advantage in the aspect of nutshell. The National Security Advisor frowned. He knew that it wasn't a good choice for him to speak up first. However, the development of the situation was completely out of his expectations. For the sake of his future political future, he could only go against the president's hint and continue to stand on the side of the Academy of Science. The president's science advisor looked at him in disbelief. He didn't understand that the truth was right in front of him. The Purple Sea mecha had only entered overclocking mode for 2 minutes before exploding. How could the Federation use such a standard? Why was the National Security Advisor so insistent? The truth is very clear, the science advisor said, somewhat annoyed. In the end, it was the Purple Sea mecha that exploded. What else is there to say? The Federation's new mecha standards should, of course, use the nutshell standards. The National Security Advisor shook his head and said, "A new standard is not a small matter. How can it be decided with just one battle? It should be considered comprehensively. The Purple Sea's high performance is obviously more useful to the federal military." "You're being unreasonable." The science advisor couldn't be bothered to argue with this person about stability. He said directly, "Then what's the point of arranging this battle today?" President Sieg suddenly raised his head and glanced at Lin Yuanhu. He said calmly, "Director, do you have any opinion?" Lin Yuanhu's hands, which were covered in age spots, rested calmly on the table. After a moment of silence, he said, "Under normal battle conditions, the Purple Sea has the absolute advantage. Overclocking mode is unstable to begin with, and this is just a test model. Even if the problem with the Purple Sea mecha today was not a coincidence, it can always be improved." President Sieg's expression did not change, but his mood became somewhat irritated. He glanced coldly at Lin Yuanhu. If this old director of the Academy of Science had not said anything, perhaps his opinion of this person would have improved. Lin Yuanhu seemed to not sense the president's gaze. He lowered his eyes and said slowly in an old voice, "Overclocking is a rare situation. The federal military is equipped with standard mecha. I don't think it's appropriate to use such a rare situation as a standard background comparison." This reason seemed to make a lot of sense. If it was a normal battle with 2 engines and 4 times the power output, the superior performance of the Purple Sea mecha would indeed be extremely outstanding. However, at this moment, Another voice rang out in the conference room. General Miles said slowly, "I don't agree with Dean Lin's opinion. It will be very common for the new mecha to enter overclocking mode in the future." The Federation's Minister of Defense was hospitalized due to illness. Meanwhile, Zhou, who was in charge of the department's work, could not directly participate in the discussion at the highest level due to the collective actions of certain powers. At this moment, in the small conference room, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and commander of the 1st Military Region, General Miles, was undoubtedly the absolute representative of the military. Chapter 257. In the battle for the standards of the MX mecha, General Miles, as one of the most important figures in the military, had once leaned towards the Federal Academy of Sciences Purple Sea mecha. On one hand, he had been influenced by certain people, and on the other hand, he respected Director Lin Yuanhu. Having been in the military for decades, he knew better than anyone how much the Federal Academy of Science had contributed to the Federal Army. In fact, it was not just him. That 3-star female General Hong Yuliang, who was cruising in space, had leaned towards the standards of the Academy of Science in the beginning for this reason. However, the Federal Army was loyal to the Federation and the representative of the Federation, Mr. President. The excellent traditions of the past many years allowed this iron-like army to not lose its way amidst the prosperity of interstellar space. These military bigwigs, when faced with a major issue that involved the combat power of the Federal Army, would immediately abandon their former personal standpoints and completely stand from the perspective of the Federation to consider the problem. The results of today's battle were already out. The words of Director Lin Yuanhu earlier had made President Sieg very dissatisfied, and a trace of displeasure had also surged in General Miles's heart. How difficult was it for the federal military to cultivate an excellent pilot? Did they have to let the military pilot that Purple Sea which could explode at any time? Even Lieutenant Colonel Li Feng had lost to an engine explosion, let alone other pilots. Therefore, when Director Lin Yuanhu felt that the new MX mecha's overclock state was rare, and could not be used to compare the strengths of the two mecha, he had to stand up and say something. As the number one figure in the military in the present conference room, his words carried a lot of weight. And to a certain extent, he also represented the military's opinion on this battle. Mr. President has been personally paying attention to the development of the new MX mecha. General Miles looked around coldly and explained, "The reason for this is actually very clear to everyone in the conference room right now. That is because of the information received from the Empire. The Empire's development of the new mecha has already begun, and they have made a breakthrough. As for what level of breakthrough, we have no way of knowing. Everyone has seen today's battle. Under the support of the new MX mecha's supermaneuverability, the mecha's self-contained long-range firepower system has been greatly reduced. As long as the enemy is unable to concentrate their firepower in a short period of time, an MX mech is a great gun that can penetrate the enemy's formation and engage in difficult battles. Whether it is the Federation or the Empire, if they want to prevent the enemy's new mecha from launching a surprise attack in a complicated environment and a low-intensity electronic surveillance battlefield, there is only one way to do so." General Miles solemnly extended a finger and said in a heavy tone, "Use a new mecha against a new mecha, and it's close combat. I'm not used to underestimating the Federation's enemies. We can assume that the Empire's new mecha are similar to the Federation's MX in terms of performance, and that they were developed at about the same time. In that case, the new mecha's close combat capabilities will be an important factor in influencing the situation on the battlefield." General Miles frowned and stopped the National Security Advisor from interrupting. He continued, "We all know that overclocking combat is not a stable special state. In a normal battle, no pilot would be willing to enter this state. However, the problem is that the battle of the new mecha is close combat. If you want to kill the enemy and not be killed by the enemy, you can only enter the overclocking combat state. Overclocking is very dangerous. Those barbaric bastards in the Imperial Royal Mecha camp only have melodramatic thoughts of dying for a just cause. Would they be afraid of this kind of danger? Of course they wouldn't be afraid. Then what about us? Even if the pilots of the Federal Army are afraid, they can only not be afraid. Because if they are afraid, they will die. That's why I said that in future planetary surface battles, the new mecha's overclocking combat will be the norm. General Miles glanced at Director Lin Yuanhu and said slowly, "The stability of the mecha in the overclocking state is the most urgent requirement of the federal military. Performance is very important, but stability is even more important. The military has always followed this standard when purchasing. We will never let our own young people take this kind of risk." General Miles's speech was very brief, but the people in the conference room were all experienced people. They naturally understood what he meant. The battle between the Federation and the Empire would be a battle of the new mecha against the new mecha. Under this kind of situation, if the Federation pilots were to operate a mecha that would explode in less than 3 minutes after entering the overclocking state, how would they have any chance of winning? Lin Yuanhu's calm face looked even older. The emotions that he had forcefully suppressed earlier, because of the federal military's stance, began to wreak havoc in his withered body again. He subconsciously pressed lightly on the left side of his chest. After a long silence he said, "The stability problem is not unsolvable. The problem can only be solved when the problem is discovered. With the excellent performance of the Purple Sea, if this problem can be solved, it will also give the outstanding young people of the Federation a greater advantage on the battlefield in the future." Listen to the technical report first. President Sieg rudely interrupted Lin Yuanhu's explanation. He did not give any face to this Federation academic leader, and walked out of the conference room directly. Outside the conference room, the deputy director of the Office of the President's Residence, Breen, had been waiting. She took the document from the president's hand and glanced at it from the corner of her eyes. Then she saw President Sieg nod inconspicuously. Breen trailed behind the crowd. She took out her encrypted phone and dialed a number. After a moment, she said softly, "Madam, Nutshell's performance is very good." None of the important people of the Federation who were walking toward the command hall noticed Breen's call. The National Security Advisor, who had walked a step behind President Sieg, saw the president's gloomy expression and hurried footsteps. He knew that what he had said in the conference room earlier was very inappropriate. Although President Sieg's term as president was about to end, the National Security Advisor did not want his personal relationship with him to be affected. He decided to explain something. Today, the one representing the Federal Academy of Sciences Purple Sea Mecha is Lieutenant Colonel Li Feng. He is the grandson of that old man in Philadelphia. The National Security Advisor lowered his voice and said, "I considered this point, which is why I felt that if we used Nutshell as the standard, it might be a bit inappropriate. What kind of person do you think Marshal Li is?" President Sieg abruptly turned around and reprimanded Li Yundong without any trace of politeness. His voice was not loud, but his tone was very heavy. The criteria for deciding the battle is the Marshal's suggestion. Don't treat Marshal Li as an ordinary person. The National Security Advisor frowned slightly and said softly, "But it is not easy for the Federation to establish a heroic figure." There was a lot of unsaid meaning in this sentence. President Sieg's expression was dark. He thought to himself that this teacher was really getting worse and worse. He was actually using that insensible Marshal of Philadelphia to pressure the current president. He said slowly, "You don't need to worry about this matter. I have already issued an order earlier. The details of this mecha battle will be kept completely secret. The Bureau of Proclamation will list it as a fifth-order incident. The auxiliary flying wing effect in a vacuum environment cannot be fully displayed. But when Keijishin's mecha is climbing, the auxiliary flying wing's jet engine is very efficient in adjusting the mecha's posture." On the platform in the command hall, the large holographic screen was replaying the previous battle. Complex data and functional diagrams flashed past the screen as evidence for arguments. The chief technical director of the Ministry of National Defense held a cursor in his hand and marked the contents of the holographic screen. His voice was transmitted through a microphone, echoing clearly in the center of the hall. The technicians of both sides were seriously checking the accuracy of the data. The technicians of the military were providing content for the director on the platform. The important figures of the Federation on the platform listened silently and seriously. The hall was silent. "Everyone, please pay attention to the CLK value and CLS value." The technical director used a cursor to point at the two curves on the holographic screen. Suppressing the excitement in his heart, he said as calmly as he could, "The power output indicators of the two test mecha have already greatly surpassed the limits of current technology. The quadruple power output of the twin engines has been fully demonstrated. The new ADS adaptive suspension system has also performed very well in this test. According to the data just obtained, the adaptive suspension systems of the 2MX mecha should be able to last for another 200 minutes or more during the passive wear and tear period. The technical director of the base coughed lightly and looked seriously at the important figures on the platform. He knew that most of them, including President Sieg, would not be able to understand these technical jargon. He paused for a moment and then said with a smile, although the cause of the engine failure of Mecha number 1 under overclocking has not yet been found, we can basically say that the Federation's revolutionary dual-engine mecha has been a success. It was a very normal sentence, but the command hall was filled with enthusiastic applause. The competition for the new MX mecha standard was just a game of chess between the internal forces of the Federation. However, today's results showed that no matter who won or lost, in this vast galaxy, the Federation as a whole had already run ahead of the Empire. As a citizen of the Federation, everyone would feel proud of this. The experts and professors of the Federal Academy of Science were also applauding, but their expressions were not as relaxed and excited as those of the Nutshell Engineering Department. The technical director of the base spent another 10 minutes to report all the data from today's battle test. Then, the Academy of Science in charge of Mecha number 1 chose a representative to come up on stage and give a final summary. This was a professor who looked to be in his 40s or 50s. The professor's expression was rather awkward, but he still very seriously repeated some of the important data, and then said seriously, regarding that last malfunction of the Purple Sea mecha, we believe that it was an accident during overclocking. In this test, the superior performance of the Purple Sea mecha has already been fully demonstrated. We cannot use a single accident to deny the excellence of the Purple Sea mecha. This is not in line with the spirit of science. As these words left his mouth, the experts and professors of the Academy of Science all nodded. The federal military mechanics and engineers maintained their silence. Some of them recalled the terrifying performance of the Purple Sea mecha earlier, and felt that these words made sense. If the Federation gave up just like this, it would be too much of a pity. However, the technicians of the Nutshell Engineering Department were not having it. They did not care at all how many high-ranking officials and generals were on stage. They even completely forgot about the existence of the president. They whistled and began to make a ruckus. The Academy of Science professor on stage, however, calmed down at this time. He pretended that he did not hear the heckling of the Nutshell Engineering Department and said with great sincerity, "If that failure can be resolved and the superior performance of the Purple Sea mecha is preserved, I believe that this is the best ending." That professor said a few more things, but Shangqiu did not listen at all. She only lowered her head to process the data sent over by her subordinates, weighing in her mind what she was going to say on stage later. She thought about Su Lu, who was still above the old moon, and thought silently in her heart that this matter was not over yet. She was going to represent Su Lu and certain people to give Director Lin Yuanhu, as well as everyone in this hall, a big surprise. Don't care what they say. Supervisor Jose hurried over at this time and put his phone into his pocket. He smiled at Shangqiu's side and said, "The matter has been settled. The president has already decided to use our standards." I am not surprised by this. The Academy of Sciences electronic jet design has a problem. The stability of the dual engines under overclocking is something they have no way of solving at all. Shangqiu raised her head and used her fingertips to push up the frame of her glasses on the bridge of her nose, as she said this with a smile. Her smile gradually faded, because she found that Supervisor Jose's expression was rather serious. At this time, the command hall was in a state of chaos. That Academy of Science professor was still trying hard to salvage something, but the audience was in an uproar. No one had noticed the conversation between her and Jose. Did you and Sulu know about this result beforehand? Mr. Jose was not looking at her, but rather at Professor Chan Shu of the Academy of Science on stage. That professor was saying at this time that the Purple Sea's final failure should have been caused by overheating of the engine system after overclocking for too long. As long as the corresponding design changes were made, this problem could be solved. Hearing this, Shangqiu was slightly taken aback. She did not understand why Supervisor Jose would say this at this time. Even if the company had guessed what she was going to do when she went on stage later, wasn't this something that should be done? I've already asked Mr. CEO. Supervisor Jose lowered his head and said softly, since we've already won, let's not cause any more trouble. After all, we are all part of the Federation. Forcing the leader of the Federation's academic community into a corner and humiliating an old man is not something to be happy about. Shangqiu was silent for a long time, analyzing the meaning of Supervisor Jose's words in her heart. A moment later, she raised her head and looked at him with a very complicated gaze. She said, I don't know what kind of deal these big shots of the Federation made in those few minutes just now, but Mr. Jose, you should know very well that I'm just a simple-minded technician. I promised Su Lu, so I will definitely do it. Jose did not think that she would actually dare to reject his arrangements in front of his face. His brows furrowed extremely tightly, and he lowered his voice and quickly reprimanded, the President, the Parliament, the Board of Directors, the entire Federation. No one is willing to hear what you want to say later. He spoke sincerely and sternly. Seeing Shangqiu lower her head and not say anything, he knew that she should have tacitly agreed to his arrangements. Only then did he let out a breath of relief. He sighed softly and said, Dean Lin will hand in his resignation tomorrow. After all, his position in the hearts of the people is very high. If a scandal were to erupt at this time, the government's credibility in the hearts of the Federation's citizens will probably drop to a terrifying level. At this time when the Empire is about to make a move, the Federation needs the citizens' absolute trust in the government. Chapter 258. Seeing the technical representative of Nutshell take the stage, the command hall immediately became much quieter than before. Then, another round of applause rang out. This time the applause was softer, but it lasted longer. The technicians of Nutshell looked excitedly at the young technical director on the stage. They knew better than anyone what kind of decisive role this genius female PhD had played in the development of the MX mecha. Even the military generals on the viewing platform began to applaud, expressing their admiration for the technical prowess of the younger generation of the Federation. After the applause died down, Shangqiu still did not speak. She flipped through the data gently, as if she had encountered an extremely difficult problem. After a long time she took a deep breath and said slowly, just now Professor Cui from the Academy of Science said that the two mecha almost broke down at the same time in the end. I would like to explain this problem first. The final collapse of Nutshell's little white flower mecha was due to the long period of external attacks. On this point we have to admit that the pilot controlling the Purple Sea had great combat power. On the other hand, the collapse of the Purple Sea was due to an internal engine error. In future battles with the Empire, which one is more fatal is a very simple logical question. At this point, Shangqiu paused for a moment. She habitually used the tips of her slender fingers to push up the frame of her glasses on her nose. Her nails were not painted with anything, looking very fresh and beautiful. She knew very well that Manager Jose's strict orders from below the stage were not false. This Federation actually did not welcome the things she had wanted to do at the beginning. When Su Lu had first released the news online, the President's office had already been enraged. They had wanted to beat the leader of the Federation's academic community down to the ground. Moreover, they had wanted to ruthlessly step on his old face. This had indeed touched the sensitive nerves of many important people and hurt many people's interests, even if these important people had initially stood on the opposite side of the Federal Academy of Science. However, this actually had nothing to do with the trust of the citizens towards the government that Jose had just mentioned. This was purely a matter of face for the Federation. The class that controlled this Federation did not want to show their ugly side in front of the ordinary citizens of the Federation. Even the citizens of the Federation probably did not want to know about Director Lin Yuanhu's moral problems. Once the beautiful image of a master idol was shattered, it would bring about mental pain. Thus, most people would rather not know the truth, only living in the lofty facade created by the newspapers and periodicals. Shangqiu thought to himself in a self-deprecating manner. Wasn't he the same? Before Su Lu used data, calculations, and today's facts to convince her, how could she believe that Dean Lin Yuanhu would do those things? She was not going to say anything else, so she closed the calculation she had been preparing for a long time. Slowly raising her head, she said, "The Purple Sea mecha's performance is indeed excellent, but since it is a new military standard mecha, its stability is of course Suddenly, she saw familiar faces on her right. They were her partners who had worked day and night with her for several years. Her partners all had puzzled expressions on their faces. They were probably wondering why Shangqiu was so calm today. The other people in the command hall were not surprised. A young and beautiful female engineer was able to become a first-class technical supervisor of the Nutshell Engineering Department. There must be a lot of different things about her. The people of the federal military felt that this level of calmness was the quality of the engineer who designed the MX mecha. I can't go on, Shangqiu suddenly said with a frown. Shangqiu suddenly frowned and said. Then she took off her glasses and threw them on the table. Looking at the people on the stage, she took a few deep breaths and said, because this is not what I wanted to say. Below the stage, Mr. Jose's expression darkened slightly. He had received a call earlier and found out about the final decision of the madam, the board of directors and Mr. President. That was why he had spoken to Shangqiu earlier. However, at this moment, it seemed that Shangqiu on the stage had lost control of her emotions. He was about to send someone else up when a voice rang out from the stands. What did you originally want to say? Then say it. The people in the command hall turned to look and found that the speaker was President Sieg. Shangqiu glanced at the president with some surprise, and then glanced at Dean Lin not far from the president's side. She found that in these few hours Dean Lin Yuan, who looked quite a few years older. She was silent for a long time. Her fingertips on the table suddenly brushed against the frame of her glasses. She paused slightly as if waking up. Taking a deep breath, she flipped open the data book on the table and said in a clear voice, regarding today's MX Mecha combat test, I only want to say a few points. 1. The Nutshell Engineering Department won. 2. Since 14 years ago, when the seniors of the Nutshell Engineering Department started the project, the design goal of the MX Mecha was close combat at high speed. The MX Mecha will definitely, and is currently changing the way land combat is conducted in the future. Only new mecha can deal with new mecha, and overclocking combat will be very common. An MX that cannot support overclocking combat is not an MX at all. 3. The Purple Sea's final engine failure was not a problem of overheating, but a fatal flaw in the design. This design error cannot be fixed at all unless the assembly system is modified. At this time, a professor from the Academy of Science in the audience suddenly protested softly. Since it can be modified, why say that it cannot be fixed? Shangqiu glanced at him and said word by word, because the Academy of Science's design started from a wrong parameter in the momentum measurable function model. In reality, after correcting this parameter, the assembly design that can be made will definitely lose a portion of its mobility. There is only one way to solve this problem. The Nutshell Engineering Department discovered this wrong parameter and corrected it, resulting in the current little white flower. If the Academy of Science can fix this error, the final mecha engine system they design will definitely be identical to the little white flower we designed. And now we already have the little white flower. Is there a need to modify the Purple Sea into a little white flower? These words echoed in the command hall. The professors and experts in the Academy of Science area all revealed angry expressions. Although the design philosophy of the two MXs was the same, the basic core data and function model had been researched separately. What right did the Nutshell Engineering Department have to be so sure that if the Academy of Science's MX was to be modified, they could only go down the Nutshell Engineering Department's old path? Shangqiu lowered his head slightly and said softly, the reason why I am so sure of this is because I know, and some people know as well. The theory, core data, and function model used by the Federal Academy of Sciences MX Mecha to solve the problem of the electron jet are exactly the same as the Nutshell Engineering Department's data. This is the fourth point I want to make today, and also the last point. The meaning of this sentence was a bit of a mouthful, but how could the many experts immersed in the field of science not understand? Shangqiu was officially accusing the Federal Academy of Science of plagiarizing, or stealing the results of the Nutshell Engineering Department's research on the electron jet. For a moment, the entire command hall was in an uproar. The staff of the Nutshell Engineering Department had already heard of this rumor through the internet. Although they did not understand why engineer Shangqiu was so sure, they were not too surprised. However, the experts of the General Assembly Base and the Federal Academy of Science were also a bit angry. Plagiarism was without a doubt the most serious accusation in the academic world. The research and development of the MX Mecha at the Federal Academy of Science had always been personally led by Dean Lin Yuanhu. How could these members of the Federation's academic community believe that the respected leader would do such a shameless thing? Shangqiu raised his head and put on his glasses again. He did not look at the increasingly hunched body of the old man in the stands. Instead, he looked at the still angry experts of the Academy of Science and said calmly, "I know this is a very serious accusation, but it is also the truth. Because long before this battle, I and another technical supervisor of the engineering department had already calculated from the original data that the Purple Sea mecha, after entering the overclocked state, would not last more than 3 minutes." After saying this, Shangqiu connected the data storage box in his hand to the instrument on the table. On the holographic screen in the command hall, a few complex structural design diagrams appeared, as well as a few important parameter deviations that did not involve confidentiality. Looking at the rolling diagrams and parameter analysis on the holographic screen, the experts and professors gradually quieted down. They felt that the whole thing was beginning to develop in a strange direction. Shangqiu's indifferent voice continued to sound in the command hall following the results of these calculations. The failure of the experiment last autumn was precisely due to a problem with the Z4 electron jet. The MX must complete the capture of the electron jet traces. The core data we used to solve this problem was the result of the research of Professor Shun Yulin of the Husk Institute. Let us begin our calculations from this original function model with the wrong parameters. The orientation of the particle entering the pipe interface is as shown on the diagram. The structural changes of the mecha's engine containment chamber are as shown on the diagram. The problem is that after the MX enters the overclock state, the dual-engine particle containment chamber will be in a quantum full state for a long time. The originally captured electron jet traces will change slightly again. The modified Z4 electron jet requires a second adjustment, but with the current level of technology of the Federation, this is something that cannot be done. After a long period of hard work, the Nutshell Engineering Department found and corrected the wrong parameter, changing the design of the Z4 electron jet once again. In order to do so, they sacrificed a portion of the power output. However, they successfully avoided the fatal problem that would occur in the engine under quantum saturation. Let us continue to follow the Academy of Sciences design and calculate downward. Because of the existence of the wrong parameter, the Purple Sea Z4 electron jet design still followed the first path. The result of this was that the engine of machine number 1 suddenly stopped working. In the quiet command hall, Shangqiu used simple words and the clear calculation process on the holographic screen to clearly and directly calculate why the Purple Sea's mecha had stopped working. She pushed up her glasses and looked down at the experts of the Academy of Science. Calmly, she said, "We only need to calculate, and we will know the final result." The last blueprint appeared under the holographic screen in the command hall. It was a drawing of the cracks on the inner wall of the engine made under laboratory conditions. Those cracks spread out in a radial pattern, leaving traces that could be seen. It was a shocking sight. The Purple Sea mecha on Mount Kaki in the old month has already entered the recovery program. Later, we can compare the remaining traces of the Purple Sea mecha's engine with this blueprint that I calculated beforehand. It will be very clear that the core data and functional model used by the Purple Sea mecha were all data that the Nutshell Engineering Department had long grasped. Below the stage, a professor from the Federal Academy of Science suddenly shouted, "What does this mean? This can't prove anything." Shangqiu knew that this professor was the person in charge of the high-amplitude particle physics laboratory in the Federal Academy of Science and Technology. She frowned and replied, "If it wasn't for the Purple Sea explosion today, I indeed wouldn't have been able to prove anything. However, these radial patterns on the inner wall of the engine are enough to prove that your Academy of Science has done something." "You have no evidence," the person in charge retorted angrily. It must be that the Nutshell Engineering Department stole the data of the Academy of Science beforehand and found this hidden danger, but he didn't say anything. Now, he is using it to shamelessly slander us. Shangqiu guessed that the professor below the stage must have been involved in the theft of the data. Otherwise, he wouldn't be so angry. Even now, he still insisted on quibbling. She could no longer control her emotions and said angrily to the people below the stage, "Don't forget that Professor Shinyulin's core data was electronically protected. There is a backup in the Federal Central Computer. If you were just using it as a reference, no one would have found anything, but you actually copied it completely. With the backup of the central computer and the traces on the inner wall of the engine, this is irrefutable evidence. The female engineer looked at the silent Academy of Science professors with disappointment. After a moment, she said softly and indifferently, "You people are like clumsy thieves. You copied the test papers of your deskmate, but in the end, you even copied the answers that we wrote wrong at the beginning." The Federation's academic community is controlled by a group of shameless and stupid people like you. What future can there be? This analogy was very good and powerful. The Academy of Science was directly hit speechless and did not have the courage to make any more excuses. On the stage, Shangqiu's face was full of disappointment. She took a few deep breaths before she suppressed the complicated emotions in her heart and prepared to leave the stage. However, at this moment, Dean Linyun slowly stood up and asked, "Do you have anything else to ask?" Shangqiu was silent for a long time. She then said, "The time of the Purple Sea engine failure that we calculated should be 3 minutes later, but in reality, it happened 37 seconds earlier." Lin Yuanhu's body looked particularly bleak in the stands. He nodded and replied, "I don't have much research on quantum dynamics. After getting Yulin's data, based on my years of knowledge and intuition, I always felt that there was a parameter in the function model. It always seemed a bit out of place and a bit unsightly when placed in the queue. The older a person is, the more timid they become. Not to mention, this is the microscopic domain that I am not good at. Therefore, I did not make any changes to this parameter. I only reminded my colleagues in the institute to add a high-sensitivity device to the Z4 electron jet. Once there was an abnormal situation in the engine reactor, it would react. The Purple Sea engine did fail, but it did not spread to the fuselage and cause a full-scale explosion. I am very comforted by this." Shangqiu suddenly asked, "Is it an irreversible cooling reaction?" "Yes." Chapter 259. With the data backup from the Federal Central Computer in the basement of the Bureau of Proclamation, as well as the radial crack distribution on the inner wall of the engine calculated by the Nutshell Engineering Department beforehand, unless the Nutshell Engineering Department could predict the future, there was no other explanation other than the Academy of Science plagiarizing the Nutshell Engineering Department's data. The broken engine of the Purple Sea mecha far away in the old moon was no longer important, at least to the Academy of Science. If the burn flow traces on the engine were really the same as the image Shangqiu had shown them, this kind of post-mortem investigation would be a humiliation they could not bear. When the young female engineer from the Nutshell Engineering Department mentioned this point, Dean Linyun knew that there was no point in hiding the truth anymore. So he stood up somewhat tiredly and said a few words to the other party, indirectly admitting that the Academy of Science had plagiarized Professor Shen Yulin's core data. The old dean had already stood up at this time. He narrowed his somewhat cloudy eyes and looked at the female engineer on the stage. The age spots on his face were particularly clear. At this moment, he looked at the young woman and thought of Shen Yulin in the cemetery. He thought of Shen Yulin's last disciple in the old moon, that guy called Sulu. Some time ago, Dean Lin Yuanhu had gone to the Milky Way cemetery to see Professor Shen's grave. After all, the two of them were once close friends. Although in their long lives, because of a certain despicable person, they had parted ways, Dean Lin Yuanhu bowed slightly in all directions and did not say a word. Back then, he needed to perfect the design of the warship's multi-engine system. He needed the Academy of Science's resources and a step forward, so he secretly copied and extended Professor Shen Yulin's M-series design. That was how he gained the glory and status of the past few decades. Decades had passed, and Shen Yulin was already dead. Under his suppression, no one dared to mention the academic storm from back then. He was still used to working and living that way, but in the end, he suffered the heaviest blow of his life in the development of the MX mecha. That guy who likes to smoke, could he be laughing at me in the cemetery right now? The old and weak Dean Lin thought to himself. The entire command hall was dead silent. At this time, no one dared to open their mouths because the truth that Shangqiu had revealed was too shocking. The important figures of the Federation in the stands all looked towards the president, but all they saw was President Sieg's incomparably gloomy face. Shangqiu looked at the thin figure of Dean Lin in the stands, and countless complex emotions welled up in her heart. She actually couldn't bear to look at this hunched old man. Although she knew very well that Su's mission was to seek justice, the Academy of Science and Dean Lin Shu's reputation, she still lowered her head silently and began sorting through the data evidence. Back then, Lin Yuanhu had led the Federation's scientific community to successfully develop the M52 mecha and perfected the design of the warship's multi-engine system. Then the Federation's mobile company produced the mecha, establishing an immortal contribution. With his position in the Federation these past few years and the substantial results he had achieved, if he just stepped down from the position of Dean of the Academy of Science, it would be enough to earn him a lifetime of respect. However, the human heart was never enough. Just as Li Xiuzhu had once lamented, the most difficult hurdle in Lin Yuanhu's life was the word name. Before this academic leader retired, he had still wanted to carve his name on the revolutionary new mecha, putting in another heavy chip to win the Nebula Lifetime Achievement Award, but in the end he had failed because of this matter. Shang Qiu was a student of the capital university, but she had once sat in on Dean Lin's lectures at the First Military Academy. Lin Yuanhu's perfect explanation of the warship's multi-engine system had a great impact on her. The reason she could finally complete the design of the dual-engine system based on the research of her predecessors in the Nutshell Engineering Department could be said to have a lot to do with Dean Lin's research results. Today, in front of everyone, she had accused Lin Yuanhu of plagiarism. The moment she lowered her head to tidy up, she couldn't help but think of a scene from 4 years ago. That year, the Dean of the Federal Academy of Science, Lin Yuanhu, paid a rare visit to the Shell Motor Company's space headquarters. He gave a speech to the design staff and promised to answer questions after the speech. At the time, Shang Qiu had already entered the Nutshell Engineering Department. After hearing the news, she asked for leave at the last minute to attend this rare event. However, after the speech, the space headquarters venue was silent. Lin Yuanhu stood on the podium for a long time, but still, no one asked a question. When the respected dean left with a smile, the human resources manager of the Nutshell Space Headquarters asked the engineering staff in confusion, "This is such a rare opportunity. Why didn't you raise your hand to ask a question?" After a moment of silence, one of the engineers replied with a sigh, "If you asked the creator to ask a question, would you dare?" At the time, Shang Qiu also held the same view of this old man in the Federation's academic community. However, today she had personally knocked him off his pedestal. She silently hugged the documents and walked down the podium. She didn't pay attention to Mr. Jose, who was frowning. She also didn't speak to her colleagues beside her. She directly sat down in her seat. The command hall was silent. However, this silence was completely different from the silence in the venue that year. President Sigurd stood up with a heavy expression. He didn't even look at Lin Yuanhu and left the command hall. Lin Yuanhu stood quietly in the center of the viewing platform. His body was slightly bent, and he looked unusually desolate. In the dead silent polar region of the moon, a formation of 4 spaceships flew to the platform at the top of Mount Kaki. The spaceships reluctantly landed. The mechanical door at the bottom of the spaceship opened. The thick mechanical arm began to retrieve the mecha. The 3 major systems of the Purple Sea mecha were basically all scrapped. After the Purple Sea mecha fell, Little White Flower couldn't bear the strain of the mecha's body anymore. When the Federal military's battleship took off, the 2 mechas were like 2 piles of garbage. They couldn't make any angry objections to the rough movements of the thick mechanical arm. The mechanical arm retracted. The mechanical door at the bottom of the spaceship closed. With a large jet of air, the spaceship broke free of the moon's gravity and flew towards the dark side of the moon. Inside the spacious spaceship, dozens of soldiers were busy inspecting the spaceships. Under the control of the computer, the ring-shaped metal mechanical arm was quickly dismantling the 2 scrapped mechas. Whether it was the descendant of the Lees of Philadelphia or the Nutshell Mecha Master who won the final victory, to the Federal military, they were all extremely valuable assets. The Federal military naturally didn't want their safety to be in any danger. In the cockpit, Su Li's lips were already curled up with dry flying skin. After Little White Flower stopped working, he took the initiative to remove the simulation system and put it back into the black box. He then changed into the backup operations suit. He knew that this black box wouldn't be able to hide it from the military researchers, but he didn't want to tell them anything. As one of the designers of the MX mecha and the pilot who won, Su Lu had this confidence in his heart. The cabin door opened. The soft artificial light replaced the harsh light of the stars in the vacuum environment. Sulu squinted his eyes and immediately adapted to the environment inside the spaceship. With the help of a few medical personnel, he forced himself to suppress the soreness in his muscles and crawled out of the cockpit with difficulty. Looking back, he saw that the beautiful little white flowers mecha was no longer the same as before. It was like it had been kicked countless times. It was black and distorted. It was very ugly and miserable. What is this? Two military mechanics in charge of collecting data lifted the black leather box and asked Sulu. Sulu blinked tiredly and said, "Personal item. You can check the catalog. Please don't touch it." On the other side of the spacious cabin, Lieutenant Colonel Li Feng in the Purple Sea mecha also walked out with the help of the soldiers. Purple Sea's damage was more serious than little white flowers. When the military spaceship dragged the mecha back, the researchers discovered with fear that Purple Sea's last layer of life support system was already on the verge of collapse. If they had been any slower, the pilot in Purple Sea might have directly come into contact with the vacuum of the moon's surface. However, Madman Li didn't need anyone to support him. This was because compared to Sulu, the impact on his body was smaller. From the moment Purple Sea collapsed, this 16-year-old genius pilot fell into silence. His face, which was already prone to violent expressions, was now so cold that it made people's hearts palpitate. The special operations suit from before was no longer tightly wrapped around his explosive body. He was wearing a lieutenant colonel's military uniform. Standing on the floor, he turned his head to look at the other side of the cabin. A trace of unwillingness flashed through his eyes. "Lieutenant Colonel, what is this?" A mechanic stood at the door of the cockpit and asked while holding a small box in his hand. Madman Li turned his head to look at the man and said coldly, "Personal item. Don't touch it. After checking the catalog, return it to me." In the catalog of test body components provided by the Federal Academy of Science and the Shell Motor Company, Suli's black box and Li Feng's small box were not there. The two mechanics each carried these two items and walked towards the storage compartment of the spaceship. Because the pilots of the Federal Army always had the habit of putting some special items in their mechas in order to get good omens, they didn't particularly care about these two boxes. They just felt that the personal items used by these two ace pilots to suppress their mechas were a little too big. One of the mechanics was numbering the items when he suddenly asked curiously, "That lieutenant colonel named Li Feng, I heard, he's the grandson of the army god?" The other mechanic frowned and said, "Just now, the captain passed on the order from the department. This mecha battle is to be kept a secret. Apparently, it's an incident involving the fifth sequence of the Bureau of Proclamation. What are you still talking about?" "I'm just talking to you. Besides, I don't mean to be disrespectful to the army god. I'm just very curious. What kind of mechas do the Lees of Philadelphia usually use? You should know that when we were in the 7th Armored Division, our division commander's most precious special mecha camp usually used his own women's underwear." That person smiled and said. Then his gaze fell on the two boxes. Chapter 260. If these two mechanics really had the guts and ability to open these two boxes, perhaps they would be able to get close to one of the secrets of the Lees of Philadelphia that allowed them to roam the universe. However, it was unknown whether they were lucky or unlucky. The Federal Army's strict discipline and their respect for the two mechanics prevented them from trying to do such a thing. After going through the careful inspection of the medical equipment and medical personnel, and after a few more scans, Sulu was finally allowed to take a proper bath. However, even the bath process was under the supervision of a second lieutenant. There were actually not many people who had personally witnessed the mecha battle today, but the Federation military spaceship in charge of the follow-up procedures had a general understanding of the situation. Although the military personnel on the spaceship were particularly strict in their monitoring, their eyes often revealed a respectful expression. After all, Sulu was a normal person. After washing away his tiredness with the hot water and relieving some of his soreness, he changed into a comfortable military uniform without epaulets. Looking at the eyes of the military personnel who followed him, he gradually began to enjoy the feeling of victory. He knew that Madman Li was definitely going through the same procedures as him, but what puzzled him was that the spaceship seemed to have received some sort of order, and he was most likely being isolated. Perhaps this was the federal military's standard procedure? Sulu thought for a while, then sat on the chair and looked at the scenery outside the window. He silently calculated the time in his heart, and then looked at the edge of the upper right side of the window. He confirmed that this spaceship was not flying towards the old moon base, but towards the dark side of the moon. This place is closer to the fleet base, the second lieutenant explained. Sulu nodded, recalling that there were several secret bases of the Federal fleet on the dark side of the moon. Is there anything you need me to do? The second lieutenant asked politely. Yes, when can my box be returned to me? Sulu was very concerned about this. The standard follow-up procedures have been completed. After the higher-ups give the order, when you leave the old moon base, the box will be returned to you. The second lieutenant replied with a smile. Thank you. Sulu rubbed his stomach, then suddenly said self-deprecatingly, Can you give me something to eat? Yes, the more the better. Yes, after experiencing such a thrilling mecha battle, in order to control the simulation system, the abundant burning energy in his body had not been completely depleted, but the common hunger in his stomach was surging up again. Under the second lieutenant's incredulous gaze, Sulu ate 12 pieces of bread and drank 7 cups of protein milk before wiping his mouth in satisfaction. The hunger subsided slightly, and he had time to reflect on the previous battle, this thrilling victory, the explosion of the Purple Sea engine, and the storm that might follow. Outside the window was the desolate surface of the dark side of the moon. Black light energy conversion materials were scattered among the scattered mountains and lowlands in an irregular pattern. Sulu narrowed his eyes to look at the desolate scenery, and saw a circular base not far away. He knew that he had arrived at the secret base of the Federal fleet. To the citizens of the Federation, being able to go deep into the dark side of the old moon and see the rumored circular base of the Federal fleet was something worth bragging about. However, Sulu was not excited at all. He was thinking about other things, so he narrowed his eyes and remained motionless. Escaping from the foot of Mount Kaki to the peak, and then being suppressed by the terrifying attacks of the Purple Sea while in overclocking mode, Sulu had persevered for so long in such a passive situation. The ability that exceeded the limits of the human body had overdrawn his mental and physical strength. Sitting in the chair, he felt very tired, as if he was about to collapse. At this time, his thoughts were so complicated and chaotic. Looking at the rise and fall of the dark side of the old moon, he unknowingly fell asleep. In his dream, he thought of many things, many people, especially that righteous face of Senator Macklin, which was deeply engraved in his dream. In his dream, he only did not think of that dark dream. This was really a happy moment. The days in the Federal Fleet's circular base were very boring. After a few hours of rest, Sulu began to write his own battle test report on the standard form provided by the base. The Federation's first MX Mecha battle test had ended. The data of the Purple Sea and Little White Flower had already been compiled in the command hall. However, Sulu and Li Feng's direct reports were also very important. The first-hand experience of a pilot in a battle environment was very important for the federal military's future work in training MX pilots. The old moon standard time was 8 p.m. Only then did Sulu know why he had been sent to the Federal Fleet's circular base after the mecha battle ended. The federal military had increased the confidentiality level of this mecha battle by 2 levels. Everyone who had participated in and watched this battle had to sign a confidentiality agreement. Moreover, these data agreements had been collected by the Bureau of Proclamation and dealt with according to the 5th level. He did not know what had happened in the command hall, but after a conversation with the chief officer of the circular base, he vaguely guessed that the federal military probably did not want the news of the failure of the successor of the Lees of Philadelphia to spread. Perhaps this did not mean much now, but if the Federation and the Empire were to go to war in the future, the military would still need the name of the Lees of Philadelphia. As long as they did not admit that the Academy of Science had failed, Sulu made a call to S2 after obtaining permission from the chief officer. From Shangqiu, he found out everything that had happened in the command hall after the battle ended. The Federal Academy of Science had already concluded that plagiarism had been committed. Sulu had done what he had wanted to do. Holding the receiver, he fell silent, but his right hand was gently clenched. If the board of directors has any problems, just tell them the truth. After all, I was the one who asked you to do this. From Shangqiu's retelling, Sulu knew that the accusations made by the engineering department against Lin Yuan, who this time had angered many powers within the Federation. Even the upper management of the Nutshell Company was somewhat angry at Shang Qiu's disobedience. He could guess this possibility. After all, Lin Yuanhu had stood tall within the Federation for so many years, and who knew how many people's interests were involved with him. Technology was indeed power, or else Su Lu and Shang Qiu would not have been able to make Lin Yuanhu lose face. However, reputation was even more powerful, so from the government to the Federation, no one wanted to see these two youngsters from the Nutshell Engineering Department do such a thing. After hanging up the encrypted phone call, Su Lu was not worried about the situation. In other words, he did not care about the reputation or status that the Federation would give him. Instead, he felt a touch of disdain and anger. Even Shang Qiu did not know that the core data that the Federal Academy of Science had stolen from the laboratory had been tampered with by him. Using Shang Qiu's powerful and resonant example in the command hall, Su Lu had deliberately written a wrong answer in advance before his deskmate had plagiarized. The Federation did not want Dean Lin to be involved in a plagiarism scandal, and neither did the Nutshell Company. This was because the big shots and politicians in the upper management could play tricks and compromise to gain benefits. However, Su Lu didn't want to obtain anything. He had spent half a year and put in a lot of sweat and blood. What this 20-year-old young man wanted was only one principle. Su Lu was a good person, but he was also a vengeful and persistent person. Before old Professor Shun had passed away, he had given Lin Yuanhu an unwarranted trust, so Lin Yuanhu could only repay old Professor Shun by persevering without hesitation. He only wanted to write old Professor Shun's name on the MX Mecha, to write it in the glorious history of the Federation. He only wanted to stomp on Lin Yuanhu's name once, until it was 1,000,000 times. Now all of this had become reality. He was very satisfied. Next, it would be another old man's turn. 4 days passed. From the senior officer of the base, Su Lu found out that the military's investigation period was about to end. His mood lightened slightly. A loud metallic clang rang out. Beside the metal and cement composite wall of the circular base that was 400 meters high, the high-speed freight elevator doors closed. Su Lu and the second lieutenant who had always been by his side were in this elevator, looking out. The light of the stars flashed across the surface of the moon, illuminating countless golden shadows on the uneven surface of the moon. Those black light energy materials and hidden protrusions under the surface were so shocking in this desolate stretch of space. The circular base of the Federal Fleet occupied a large area. This high-speed freight elevator was like a small black dot on the edge of the high wall. The elevator moved up silently, the sturdy multi-layered transparent film, isolating the vacuum environment. Su Lu narrowed his eyes as he looked at the surface of the moon that was moving further and further away. He felt the insignificance of individual humans in the silent universe and fell silent for a moment. He had been under house arrest in a specific area these past few days, and had basically not encountered any military personnel. Madman Li must have also enjoyed this special treatment, but the two of them had not met. Could it be that that person was avoiding him, afraid that he would have to fulfill the bet? Su Lu looked at the large-scale scenery of the universe outside the elevator, took a deep breath and laughed happily. During the battle on Mount Kaki, Su Li's anger had almost ignited the mecha, but that was the anger in his heart, caused by his past experiences. After a few days, he no longer had the urge to trample Madman Li under his feet. On one hand, it was because he knew that Madman Li had lost to him because of the Purple Sea mecha itself. On the other hand, he always felt that it was really meaningless to compete with a 16-year-old kid. Many times, Su Lu had almost forgotten that he was only 20 years old. The sound of the elevator arriving rang out. Su Lu reluctantly retracted his gaze from the desolate scenery of the dark side of the moon, and followed the second lieutenant out. As soon as he stepped out of the elevator door, he heard a familiar voice. Because it was in the spacious corridor of the base, that person's voice was as cold and ruthless as usual, buzzing and soaring. Today was the day they would leave the circular base, head to the old moon base, and then return to planet S2. The corridor on the uppermost level of the circular base was hundreds of meters away from the surface of the moon. Standing at the edge of the transparent corridor always gave people a frightening feeling of being at the edge of a cliff. That voice was so cold and yet so loud, shaking the corridor slightly and making the surrounding soldiers feel a little scared. Madman Li was currently arguing with the officer stationed in the base with a dark face. To be precise, it was a one-sided reprimand. He was a lieutenant colonel, so there was naturally no problem in reprimanding a second lieutenant. However, that female second lieutenant with teary eyes had clearly never served such a difficult person before. Her small face was red, and she could not say anything. The uppermost level of the base was filled with senior officers. Sulu and Madman Li's identities did not need to be kept a secret to them. These officers looked over with complicated expressions, guessing why Lieutenant Colonel Li Feng had suddenly become so angry. Could it be related to that test on Mount Kaki a few days ago? Sulu was a person who had tender feelings for the fairer sex, but he was also a reasonable person. He listened silently at the elevator door for a while, and after confirming that it was Li Feng who was unreasonable, his pair of knife-like eyebrows rose up, and he slowly walked over. Surrounding the corridor on the top floor of the circular base was the spacious moon's vacuum. In the extreme distance was the highest peak on the back of the old moon. The starlight in the sky was not swallowed up by the stars, sprinkling down piece by piece. In the clear light, the officers in the corridor saw the two officers walking over from the elevator door. They recognized the other party's identity and saw him walk over to Li Feng. Their hearts immediately tightened, and among them, the ones with fast reactions immediately notified the base's commanding officer. The sound of footsteps slowly sounded and slowly descended. With his hands behind his back, Li Feng was silent for a moment, and then he slowly turned his head around. That body full of explosive strength suddenly tightened, and then he gradually relaxed. He looked at Sulu behind him and said lightly, "I never thought that you would actually know how to drive a mecha. It looks like you're not the pretty boy I thought you were. I never thought that the only seedling from the Lees of Philadelphia would only vent his anger on a woman. It looks like you really are a little idiot." For some reason, Sulu was originally a gentle and kind person, but every time he saw Madman Li, he couldn't control his sharp and unkind side. These two people were like natural enemies, and no matter who looked at the other, they were both extremely unpleasant to the eye. In the starry corridor, the two young officers were facing each other in silence. The air was filled with a tense atmosphere, and it seemed like there were electric arcs flashing incessantly. The female second lieutenant, who had been reprimanded by Madman Li until her eyes were brimming with tears, actually forgot her own sadness at this moment. She looked at this scene in astonishment and looked at Sulu in confusion, not understanding why the corridor had suddenly become so quiet. A hint of coldness flashed across Madman Li's childish face, and he slowly said, "You should know better than anyone that if it weren't for those bunch of trash from the Academy of Science, you wouldn't have been able to survive on Kaki Peak." Sulu looked at him with narrowed eyes, feeling that dangerous aura and might that assaulted his face. He said softly, "You're not convinced?" Madman Li's lips curled up slightly, and he laughed strangely. "If it were you, would you be convinced?" Sulu was silent for a long time, and then he suddenly smiled and said, "What's the use of not being convinced? You still have to call me uncle." Madman Li's expression suddenly changed. Chapter 261. Ignoring the expression on Li Feng's face, Sulu only looked at him quietly. He narrowed his eyes as if he couldn't feel the anger and murderous intent in this young lieutenant colonel's heart. He just looked at him and waited for his reply. Right at this moment, Major General Shi, the commanding officer of the circular base, rushed over after receiving the news. He was the highest military officer in the entire base. Although Li Feng was born in a prestigious family and held a high position in the Federal Army, he still didn't dare to be too presumptuous in front of him. He lowered his head slightly and moved to one side. Major General Shi looked coldly at Sulu and Li Feng. In his eyes, Li Feng was undoubtedly the most outstanding soldier. Although his personality was a bit too domineering, the Federal Army needed this kind of talent. Meanwhile, Sulu, the pilot from Nutshell Company, had obtained the final victory at Kachifeng and won his respect as a soldier. No matter who it was, he didn't want to be too harsh on them, but at this moment, he had no choice but to reprimand them. The conflict ended here, but it wasn't really over yet. At least before they left Old Moon Base, they still had to settle that bet. The military spaceship was already waiting at the highest platform of the circular base. Under the accompaniment of several soldiers, Sulu and Li Feng boarded the spaceship and flew towards the Old Moon Base. After a few hours of flight, the spaceship landed right in the middle of the large cluster of bubbles. The end of the tunnel was bright. This group of officers walked out of the underground tunnel. The busy people of the old moon base put down their work at the same time and looked over with a myriad of different emotions. The federal military and the Bureau of Proclamation had jointly issued a confidentiality order. The entire base of people who had witnessed the battle at Kachifeng were forbidden from talking about the incident. However, just because they didn't say anything didn't mean they didn't want to. The officers of the old moon base looked at Li Feng and Sulu walking in the middle of the crowd with mixed feelings. They all knew about the bet of this mecha battle, and wondered if the successor of the god of war was really going to lower his head to that skinny technical supervisor. When they reached the living area, the two sides had to separate. At this moment, Madman Li suddenly stopped. Sulu also stopped his footsteps, turning his head to look at this young lieutenant colonel's tall and sturdy back, not saying a single word. Li Feng slowly turned around. After a long silence, he took a deep breath and said in a normal voice, "Uncle Su, I hope we can meet again in the future." Sulu was slightly stunned and then he smiled. His smile was particularly bright, and his eyes were like crescent moons. He said, "You have to call me uncle when we meet. I always thought that you would never want to see me again." The old moon base's main hall, which had always maintained a silent and suffocating atmosphere, could no longer control their complex emotions after hearing these two sentences. The officers were not whispering to each other, but sighing in disappointment and helplessness. The officers who sent them to the circular base of the fleet were also speechless. When he saw Zhou Yu, Sulu knew that the military had done a very good job of keeping this test a secret. All the video recordings of the Kaki Peak had been sealed. Other than the few officers in the two bases, even the Shell Motor Company's technical team did not know who the pilot of the little white flower mecha was. Sulu originally thought that the military wanted to keep this a secret, because they wanted to protect the glory of Fei City's god of war. But he did not expect that it would also involve him. Thinking about it carefully, it was probably Lady Tai who had done some work. But why would Lady Tai do this? Sulu frowned and thought for a long time, but he still could not figure it out. 3 days ago, the Shell Motor Company's technical team had withdrawn S1 from the core area of the base. The Shell Motor Company had specially left the CEO's spaceship behind to be responsible for bringing Sulu back to the surface. This kind of treatment and honor proved that the victory of this new mecha battle was very important to the Shell Motor Company. The spaceship's cockpit was not very big, but because there were only 2 people sitting inside, it was much more spacious. Looking at the outline of the old moon behind him that was getting clearer and clearer, Sulu thought about the thrilling experience of the past few days. He could not help but feel a little shaken. A small fry talking reason with the big shots of the Federation, and so happily at that. It was really a very satisfying thing, so much so that he did not want to think about the big trouble it might bring. After the waiter delivered the wine, he left. Zhou Yu held the glass of wine in his hand and gently tasted it. Then he smiled bitterly and said, "Now that I think about it, you were right when you replaced me that day. If the one in the little white flower mecha was me, maybe we would have lost before we even reached the peak of Kaki Peak." Zhou Yu had purposely stayed at the base to wait for him. Sulu looked at the complicated expression on Zhou Yu's face and suddenly thought of the day when Bai Yulan was taken away by the Bureau of Proclamation. For excellent pilots like Zhou Yu and Bai Yulan, missing out on the first real battle of the new mecha was really a regret that could not be made up for in life. Zhou Yu seemed to have guessed what he was thinking. He finished the wine in his glass in one gulp and said with a smile, "It's a bit of a pity, but after watching the battle between you two, I don't feel too much about it." He looked at Sulu and shook his head ruefully. "Last year at UA University, your mecha piloting skills were just SOSO. Only half a year has passed. You should know that the purple sea that Madman Li controls is really terrifying to the point of being unimaginable. But you still managed to hold on. I really don't understand. Maybe I'm just lucky?" Sulu smiled and shrugged his shoulders. In reality, he knew best that he was able to hold on for so long at Kaki Peak because of the 10 stances that Uncle Feng had taught him. They seemed to be able to subtly counter the battle style of the Lees of Philadelphia. There was still a huge gap between his mecha piloting skills and that of Madman Li, but this sort of similarity and counter of styles played a huge role. Uncle Feng Yu was really a mysterious character. After the dust of the presidential election settled, It looked like he really would have to go to Philadelphia to find out more. But would he still be alive by then? Sulu narrowed his eyes and imitated Shi Qinghai's actions. He slowly sipped his wine, letting the wine flow over his tongue and evoke a spicy aftertaste. The heavy black leather case was right under his feet. According to Zhou Yu, Secretary Shen was already in contact with the Bureau of Proclamation. Sulu knew that the person in the Federation who had influence over the Bureau of Proclamation was probably that Lady Tai. He immediately relaxed and no longer worried about Bai Yulan. The Bureau of Proclamation building in the outskirts of the capital was actually not very tall and dignified. Instead, it was more like a normal research institute. That highway that only allowed entry and no exit connected this independent institute to the Federation. And deep underground in the distant universe, there were countless invisible lines that bound it to every inch of the Federation's land, making it impossible to break away. The Bureau of Proclamation of the Federation. Many years ago, it was also known as the Royal Bureau of Proclamation. In reality, this most important organization of the Federation, no matter what name it was called, only followed the 700,000-word First Charter. Following that was loyalty to the former emperor or the current Federation government. Whether it was Mr. President, the Federation Management Committee, or the enormous bodies of the 7 great families hidden in the shadows, none of them could move the Bureau of Proclamation staff at all. But they were still living people living in the Federation. Humans had to breathe and eat, and they had to interact with others. There were conflicts of interest, and naturally, things that went against the principles of the Charter would happen. This is the old man's investigation report. The middle-aged assistant director, whose hair was starting to fall off his forehead, walked into the office and said to the old man on the chair, "Director Tai, do you want to take a look? Federation mecha battle. Why did he run to the old moon base? He actually used his authority in this kind of place. How much money did the Li family give him for him to be so daring?" The director of the Bureau of Proclamation held a crutch-like object with both hands and said in a deep voice, "Send the old man's investigation report to the Federation Investigation Bureau and invite him back for tea. Also release that mercenary while you're at it. The Federation Military Court didn't even try this case, so why should we meddle?" "Yes." The assistant director took the case file but didn't leave. He said with a serious expression, "Last night, the central computer automatically generated an analysis report. Only I can see the content inside for now. Because this is a serious matter, I didn't give the authority to start the investigation." The old director narrowed his eyes slightly. He didn't know why his successor, whom he had cultivated for more than 10 years, was so shocked by the analysis report of the central computer that he actually used such a public tone instead of calling him the old man. His slightly trembling right hand left the crutches and lightly pressed the button on the right side of the office desk. A holographic light screen flashed a few times and appeared in front of him. On the screen was the analysis report that the central computer had generated after sorting out the information on its own. It was requesting the authority to investigate. The old director narrowed his eyes and looked at it for a long time, but he didn't say anything. Although the Bureau of Proclamation was independent of the Federation, the Bureau of Proclamation's organizational structure and staff were part of the Federation government. The object of suspicion in the analysis report of the central computer was so strange that he couldn't immediately make a decision. This councilman is in the prime of his life right now. Also, the suspicious points in the analysis report are too vague. We can't confirm the suspicion either. How do we investigate? The old director sighed and said, "If we let those old men in the management committee know that we are investigating him, they might use the crime of breaking the unity of the citizens of the Federation to cut our funding for next year." The assistant director shook his head and said, "I also feel that there is a problem with this report. Logically speaking, the central computer will monitor election information, but it has never paid so much attention to a presidential candidate." He continued with a frown, "This matter is a bit strange." After a long silence, the old director said, "Since it is the old man's report, we should investigate it. But I don't think we will find anything. Even if we can find out the problem with that councilman, it won't be of much use." The old man said with slight mockery, "Countless years ago, those useless ancestors of mine always said that a doctor can't be punished. Actually, the situation now is more or less the same. You should give the authority to the old man." Let him do what he wants. This old man, it seems he has been bored for too long. After nagging this sentence, the old director stood up shakily and walked out of the door. He was not holding a crutch in his hand, but a golf club. The Bureau of Proclamation would not allow the influence of the Federation to infiltrate. Thus, that high-ranking Bureau of Proclamation official who had gone to the old moon base had not even had the chance to enjoy the generous pension and manor in the Bermuda Star region provided for him by the Bureau of Proclamation before the Federation's Investigation Bureau was notified by the Bureau of Proclamation and brought back to S2 for tea. Director Jean and his assistant did not really understand why the Federal Central Computer would automatically generate a report for the presidential election. Actually, perhaps even the Central Computer itself did not really understand. That crystallization of human wisdom that had been through the baptism of who knew how many years was just mechanically or chaotically following a fixed program, arranging the sequence, collecting information, sensing the first to contact the target, to confirm the target's safety, to confirm the target's command authority, and then, in the spaceship, Sulu woke up abruptly. He wiped away the cold sweat on his forehead and gulped down a few mouthfuls of ice water with some lingering fear. At this moment, the victory of the Mecha Standards competition, Lin Yuan whose infamous reputation, Professor Shen's consolation, and Madman Li becoming his nephew. These exciting events did not make him feel happy at all. Just like on the spaceship on the back of the old moon, Sulu once again fell asleep during the journey. And once again he dreamt. Once again he kept thinking about Senator Macklin in his dream, but the final color of the dream turned into the most frightening black. In the black dream, that existence that called itself Old Thing appeared once again. This time, it did not actively contact him to confirm, but instead followed that reciprocating pathway and began to talk to him. Did he say something in the dream? Or did he say something in his mind? Sulu gulped down large mouthfuls of ice water, a hint of fear flashing through his eyes. This time he was really dreaming, unlike that time when he was awake in the laboratory. He could not recall the feelings in the dream. What one thinks in the day, one dreams at night. Sulu thought silently, thinking that what he wanted most now was of course to trample Senator Macklin to the ground, just like how he had trampled on Lin Yunhu a few days ago. A soft electronic sound rang out, reminding the two passengers in the cabin that they were about to enter the atmosphere of planet S1. Please fasten your seatbelt and do not drink. The sound woke Sulu from his thoughts. He instinctively looked out the window and saw the beautiful planet S1 taking up most of his field of vision. The thin atmosphere was like a layer of soft skin covering the outer edge of the planet. Outside the pale white boundary of the atmosphere, satellites of various types and purposes were suspended in their respective orbits, like haystacks in a wheat field. Among them, those surveillance satellites that were painted black were extremely inconspicuous. Just by relying on their high-energy batteries, these surveillance satellites seemed to be able to fly forever in space. This was part of the Federation's electronic surveillance network, part of the glory of the Charter. These were the eyes of that old thing? Zhou Yu noticed that Su Li's face was a little pale, and cold sweat was flowing down. He frowned and asked, "Did you have a nightmare?" He then smiled and comforted him. "I know that the last few waves of attacks from the Purple Sea were a little scary, but in the end you won." Sulu squinted at the satellites outside the window and shook his head. "No, there are too many things in this universe that are scarier than Madman Li." Chapter 262. There was no welcoming ceremony, no written commendation order, no news report, not even a single gathering. Sulu returned to his apartment in the Wangdu district and sat alone on the sofa, eating his instant meal box and staring blankly at the news on TV. Only after several hours had passed did he finally shake off this somewhat absurd state of mind. No matter what the color of the dream was, since that dream kept happening, then it was really not a good choice to keep thinking about it, to the point where his face was pale, his body was thin, and in the end he had coughed up blood and died. Sulu used his own coarse nerves to temporarily forget that great existence, but he still could not get used to the silence of his apartment. Developing the MX mecha and participating in Ka Chifeng's mecha combat test, Sulu had wanted to make Professor Shen's name belong to Professor Shen. He had wanted to give some big shot a slap in the face. He had wanted to indirectly strike a blow at the joint election of Governor Ross and Senator Macklin. However, he was still a young man after all. After Nutshell Company had successfully obtained the Federation's new mecha standards, as the most important participant, he had actually been forgotten by the entire Federation. Not to say that he would feel resentment, but it was still somewhat difficult to understand. He lowered his head and ate the vegetables in his meal box in big bites, crunching them loudly. Then he drank a mouthful of water and raised his head to look at the news on TV. On the news screen, the spokesperson for the Federal Academy of Science was currently dodging the reporters' questions in an extremely awkward manner. The Federation had sealed off the details of the MX Mecha's testing, but they had not sealed off the news of the MX Mecha's passing of the standards. After all, this was an event that could greatly increase the Federation citizens' sense of honor and confidence. Unlike the details of the mecha battle being hidden, Shang Qiu had accused the Federal Academy of Science of plagiarism in the command hall that day. Under the evidence, Dean Lin Yuanhu had been forced to quietly admit it. This scene had been seen by too many people, and for some reason, the Federation government did not seem to spend too much effort to cover up this scandal. During the days that Su Lu had been at the Old Moon Circular Base, the entire Federation news community had been hyping up this plagiarism scandal. Many media outlets had begun to show their spirit of beating the dog while it was down, digging up the plagiarism controversy that had caused a stir on the public network a month ago. Some had even begun to directly discuss which parts of Dean Lin Yuanhu's academic achievements when he had entered the Academy of Science many years ago and received the Nebula Award had been copied from Professor Shen Yulin. The mindset of the media was different from that of the citizens of the Federation, but they could better grasp the mindset of the citizens of the Federation. The Federal Academy of Science was the most respected top-level academic institution within the Federation, and Dean Lin Yuanhu was the most revered scholar. This scandal would hurt the feelings of many citizens, but it was also the most eye-catching event. The media naturally would not let go of such a major incident. Who knew how many people were grieving at home as they watched the news, but the media would only continue to discuss it in depth. Unfortunately, they did not manage to find any more details of the incident, and the Academy of Science did not have the face to make any more excuses. Sulu looked at the news, smiled, and then lowered his head to begin eating. Then he raised his head again to glance at the news, and ate another mouthful of rice. His mood was incomparably joyful. As he was clearing away the dishes, Sulu received a call from Major Jiao. He knew that this strange silence would soon disappear. After this call he received a call from Zhou, inviting him to eat at Linyuan. He rubbed his stomach. After Uncle Fengyu had taught him that set of martial arts, his appetite had indeed increased by the day, so there should be no problem for him to eat another meal. Of course, even if he did not have the appetite to eat, this invitation was inevitable. In Linyuan Bamboo Residence, clear spring water slowly flowed past. Zhou used two slender fingers to hold a maroon clay cup, gently sniffing the fragrance of the plum wine in the cup. Her eyelashes slightly blinked, and she secretly glanced at Su Lu across the table. A year ago, when they first met at the entrance of the nightclub in Linhai, Zhou played the role of a cold and rude rich girl. At that time, her eyes actually paused for a moment on Shi Qinghai's stunning face, but she did not pay attention to this ordinary-looking young student at all, even though he had already displayed a rare persistence and loyalty to his friends. Later, because of some very strange things, the two of them actually lived under the same roof. It was during that time that Zhou was incomparably amazed by Su Li's way of doing things. It was really difficult to find someone like him in the current Federation. At that time she also came into contact with some of Su Li's secrets, and knew that this guy would one day shock the entire Federation. She just did not expect that day to come so early. Zhou smiled slightly and raised her head. On that unadorned face, there was a faint scar on her lower jaw that was no longer clear. Her postpartum figure had recovered extremely well, but because she had to breastfeed herself, she could not even smell a hint of perfume. "I heard that you are now Madman Li's uncle?" Zhou asked with a smile, but there was a trace of lament in her words. Even that little lunatic who had defeated the unrivaled in the military and dared to charge into Parliament Hill to beat people up, had actually been defeated by Su Li's hands. This was really hard to imagine. There's something wrong with that mecha he's piloting. Being too familiar with Zhou, Su Lu did not care about his manners. He casually leaned back in his seat and shook his head, saying, "Otherwise, I'm not his match when it comes to mecha piloting. What about close-range combat?" Zhou narrowed her eyes and asked curiously. That day at the entrance to Tiger Mountain Road, she had personally seen Sulu charge up the cliff, and had also seen him kill Madman Li in 3 strikes in Linyuan. She knew that this guy's individual combat strength was also extremely fierce. You'll only know after we actually fight, replied Sulu with a smile. You're just a person who looks gentle on the outside, but in reality, you won't tolerate the slightest bit of bullying. Zhou looked at him quietly, thinking of that rumored bet. Probably only you would let the Lees of Philadelphia suffer such great humiliation and not worry about anything at all. He wants to kill me. It's not like you don't know. Sulu took a sip of wine and asked, I heard that the military did an excellent job of keeping this a secret. How did news of this bet leak out? Any secret is not a secret in certain circles. Zhou put down her wine glass and said seriously, I'm seeing you today because some people have a few words for you. There are many people who don't know, but you're now already a captain in the Ministry of Defense's General Assembly base. Based on your results this time, it wouldn't be a problem for you to be directly promoted to lieutenant colonel, but it was suppressed by the higher-ups. Major Jiao already called me just now to explain, replied Sulu. Zhou said with a trace of apology, the Nutshell Company originally prepared a very generous reward, but other than the bonus, the rest was also suppressed. Even now, many people still don't know that the person who defeated the mecha from the Federal Academy of Science was you. Sulu was silent for a long time, then suddenly opened his mouth to say, I feel a little uncomfortable, but you also know that I don't really care about these things. I don't like this attitude. When it's time to fight, you should fight. Zhou paused for a moment then said, but this time you really shouldn't fight. This should be the madam's intention. Suli's expression didn't show much surprise. He had heard Zhou mention this once at the Old Moon base. After returning to S1, he had also thought about this problem in his apartment. Using the Federation government and the military to protect the reputation of the Lees of Philadelphia, while at the same time hiding himself as much as possible, the only person who had the ability to do this was that Lady Tai. However, he didn't know why Lady Tai did this. Sulu thought of Shang Qiu. Could it be that the accusation of plagiarism in the command hall made the Tai family feel that he was too difficult to control? However, Lin Yuanhu's loss of power would be a great help to Senator Pobre's presidential campaign. The Tai family should be very clear about this, and the reaction of the Federation's press these past few days also proved this point. I haven't seen the madam recently, but according to my speculation, part of the reason should be related to your accusation of Lin Yuanhu. Zhou lowered her eyes slightly and ate the food that Sulu had ordered for her. She said, You probably didn't pay attention to the name Lin Yuanhu. Dean Lin is actually a distant relative of the Lin family. There may be disputes between the 7 major families of the Federation, but it's very rare for them to be as ruthless as what you did this time. You directly knocked Dean Lin down to the ground and even stepped on him a few times. The madam might be a little unhappy with your behavior of acting on your own without asking for permission. Lin Yuanhu? Lin Banshan Lin Dohai. Su Li's eyes narrowed. There were too many people with the surname Lin in the Federation. He really didn't think that Lin Yuanhu would be related to one of the 7 major families, the Lin family. He suddenly remembered that he was sitting in the middle of Lin Yuan. In this world, how could there be so many Lin Yuan? He lowered his head, laughed at himself and said, Ask for permission? The madam really does think of me as a member of her family. Isn't that so? Zhou quickly retorted, bringing with her a bit of original aggressiveness. Sulu had long since gotten used to her tone of voice. In the past year, Zhou had always acted as his analyst, helping him analyze the situation and determine which way to go. Even as early as when the conflict of data in the laboratory had just occurred, she had pointed out that there was a presidential election behind this matter, which had been a great help to him. Of course not, Sulu said after a moment of silence. Everyone is an independent person, isn't that right? People are people of society. Zhou shook her head and reminded him, if you just want to muddle along for the rest of your life, you can still protect yourself. But if you want to rise up in the Federation and stick to your principles, you will only suffer a lot. Let's not talk about this anymore. Sulu suddenly thought of something important and said seriously, 2 days after Lu Hua was born, I received a message from Shi Qinghai. That guy is secretly investigating Senator Macklin. I have already passed some important evidence to Shunli. After that, I couldn't contact him anymore. But I believe that he should be living quite well. Zhou Yu's thin eyebrows furrowed beautifully. After a long silence, she laughed softly and said, "What can that hooligan find out? I have said before, you better not mention this name in front of me." Little Lu Hua's parents were a very unfamiliar couple, but Su Le kept telling Shi Qinghai's story in front of Zhou Yu. In Zhou Yu's heart, that Shi Qinghai's appearance gradually became clearer, and he didn't seem like a stranger. But she would often rationally think that the spy wandering in the Federation would definitely not be as familiar with her as she was with him. This was a tongue-twisting sentence, but it explained a heart-wrenching truth. Thus, she didn't want to hear that name again, and didn't want to have anything to do with that person. Mr. Shi is a very impressive guy. Sulu thought of his good friend, who had always been taking great risks and doing things that couldn't be exposed in the dark for the sake of the light, and a sense of respect welled up in his heart. Zhou Yu and Sulu were so familiar that with just one sentence, she knew what Sulu was trying to express. She laughed softly and said sarcastically, "Is it really impressive to be as stubborn as a rock like you?" Lin Yuan's dinner time was very short, because Zhou Yu still had to go home to feed the baby. Sulu sent her to the entrance of the Shishan compound, thinking that this young and beautiful girl's most important daily life now was to take care of the child. He couldn't help but have some complicated feelings. "Come home for dinner the day after tomorrow. My father probably has something to tell you. Also, my mother keeps asking when you will be back from your business trip," Zhou Yu said helplessly after alighting from the car. Sulu smiled and agreed, just like how he had promised Deputy Minister Zhou in the cemetery that he would be the scapegoat. His life might not be considered exciting, but it was definitely strange enough. How long would he have to be the scapegoat? The night at the back of Macho Mountain was so quiet. The picturesque scenery during the day, under the blowing of the cold night wind and the illumination of the two bright moons, lost a bit of the aura of a king and gained a bit of the charm of a young lady. The image currently being broadcasted on the holographic screen was not the plagiarism incident that had caused such a stir in recent days. In the dim image, two of the Federation's newest MX mecha were engaged in an intense battle. It was the very significant test battle that had taken place a few days ago on the summit of Old Moon Kaki Peak. The federal military and the Bureau of Proclamation had worked together to seal off the details of this mecha battle. All of the video footage and data had been sealed up after going through the necessary research at the main assembly base. Logically speaking, the appearance of these images on the holographic screen was already a serious violation of the Federation's confidentiality regulations. However, the person watching these images was that lady, so this matter seemed so natural. With the light touch of a button, the holographic screen slowly retracted into the wall. Lady Tai stood up from her chair and walked towards the kitchen, a trace of melancholy mixed within the calm expression on her face. The matter of sealing off the video footage of the battle was a suggestion that Lady Tai had made to President Sieg. On the surface, it was for the sake of the reputation of the Lees of Philadelphia, but in reality, only she knew what the most important reason was. The slightly trembling body of the white mecha in the image was so familiar. Although it was only for an instant, it was deeply imprinted in her eyes. Most of the people who had seen that person operate the mecha were already dead, but there were still some people who were still alive. That daring brat, was he not afraid of dying a horrible death? Lady Tai thought to herself with a sigh as she gently stirred the white fruit porridge in the white porcelain pot. Chapter 263. There would always be many cliché stories repeated in a bar, especially when a woman like Shang Qiu, who had the ability to cause a commotion, passed by. However, Sulu always thought that he was not qualified to compete with others for a woman's affection, so the heavens would not arrange such a cliché story for him. But just as he walked a few steps out of the booth, he saw Shang Qiu snatch a glass of wine from the bar beside her and splash it directly on someone's face. Sulu was slightly shocked. He rushed to Shang Qiu's side and held her arm. It was slightly cold to the touch, and the back of his hand was tender and smooth. It was quite moving. "Are you okay?" He did not have time to see who was on the other side of the conflict. He lowered his head and asked Shang Qiu, "Did someone reach out to you?" "I'm not drunk." Shang Qiu frowned, but she did not know that she had buttoned the wrong button on her shirt. She waved her hand and said, "No one reached out. It's just that this guy said something about a young master wanting to treat me to a drink. His tone was very annoying." Sulu was slightly stunned. He turned around and saw a middle-aged man wiping the wine off his face. Looking at the middle-aged man's attire, he should be a powerful figure in the Federation. However, he was only inviting her on behalf of someone else. He did not know who the person behind this was. He did not ask Shangqiu how annoying that person's tone was because they were engineers in their bones and did not fit in with this society. Some people with power and money were used to looking down on others and using frivolity to represent their strength, but they could not get used to it. Of course, Sulu was not worried that he would not be able to clean up the mess later. Although his role in the development of MX was forcefully suppressed by the government, Shangqiu and the Nutshell Engineering Department's contributions were already set in stone. From a certain perspective, Shangqiu was now a hero of the Federation. At this time, who would be stupid enough to provoke her? Even if they made a scene in public, they would only be at a disadvantage. "I just want to invite this young lady up for a drink on behalf of my young master. I don't know why I received such rude treatment." The middle-aged man standing not far away wiped the wine off his face and angrily asked. Sulu knew the details of the matter, so naturally, he couldn't answer. He raised his head and looked up. In the luxurious partition on the second floor of the bar, there were a few young people in luxurious clothes whispering to each other. From time to time they would turn their heads and look over, as if they were commenting on him or Shangqiu. He narrowed his eyes and recognized one of the faces. He also found that the back of the person who was facing him was somewhat familiar. For a moment he couldn't help but feel a little puzzled. Although this bar was the most famous high-end nightclub next to Capital University, with the identity of the young man's family, he shouldn't have come to such a place. He didn't want to cause trouble, but he wouldn't torture himself to apologize to the middle-aged man in front of him. He was about to leave with Shangqiu when Shangqiu said with a slightly red face, "I'm in a hurry." Sulu immediately remembered this matter and walked forward with her. He was used to seeing Shangqiu Qingyan's strange appearance mixed with the spirit of an engineer. It was rare to see her blushing, so it was quite a pleasure. The middle-aged man clearly didn't expect this pair of man and woman to walk away like they didn't exist. Not only did they not apologize, they didn't even say a word of apology. Therefore, when Sulu and Shangqiu returned, there were a few more people blocking their way. "It really is a cliché," Shangqiu said with a wink. Previously on the way here, Sulu had laughed and said this kind of cliché problem. The bar was very large, so not many people would notice the abnormality in this area. Even if they did, they would be blocked out of the area by people who had come from who knew where. Sulu narrowed his eyes and looked at the people in front of him. He wasn't surprised that the other party would bring so many people to drink. After all, they were the children of aristocratic families. It was rare for them to experience the hardships of the common people, so of course they would pay extra attention to safety. At this time, a very calm voice came from above the isolated quiet area. "It's fine if you don't drink, but it's really not good for you to act like a shrew when you're so pretty. You should at least apologize to my subordinates." Some people thought that because they were elegant and calm, they could act like they were hiding needles in cotton wool. However, they didn't know that these words were really asking for a beating. Sulu looked at the silently approaching Magnolia Bai. He heard Shangqiu, who was beside him, shout directly to the upstairs, "This old lady wants to apologize to your mother." Shangqiu was 24 years old this year. She worked in the underground of the Nutshell Engineering Department for many years, so she rarely saw the sun. Her snow-white skin, elegant face, and exaggerated figure were indeed very eye-catching. However, when she said the words "this old lady," it really revealed her character. As the technical director of the Nutshell Engineering Department, she was not as simple as a beauty. The young man upstairs couldn't sit still. His face darkened as he walked down the stairs. A quiet girl in the luxurious compartment looked at him with a trace of helplessness in her eyes. Sulu looked at the young man walking down the stairs. His expression didn't change. However, when he saw Li Xiaotong, who followed him downstairs, he couldn't help but feel that it was a small world. It turned out that the familiar figure upstairs was actually the seventh young master of the Li family. When Li Xiaotong saw Sulu, He couldn't help but be slightly startled. He immediately showed a bitter smile and said, "Dohai, don't mess around. This is my friend." It was a rare scene for two of the second generation of the 7 great families to appear in this bar. The one who had asked his subordinates to invite Shang Qiu upstairs to drink was Lin Dohai. Lin Dohai's trip was originally to visit Lady Tai at the back mountain of Macho according to his family's wishes. However, he was coldly refused. He had to stay in the capital for a few days to see the situation. The Li and Lin families had been close in recent years. Li Qishao, who was in the capital, naturally had to do the reception work. However, Lin Dohai didn't want to go to those quiet clubs. He asked to come to the bar near the capital university. Lin Dohai made this choice because the quiet girl was studying at the capital university. He had invited Shang Qiu upstairs because he liked Shang Qiu's hot body. He wanted to vent his anger on the quiet girl. However, he didn't expect that the girl with the impressive figure seemed to have a strong background. Not only did she splash wine on his subordinates, but she was also called a friend by Li Qishao. After a moment of silence, Lin Dohai narrowed his eyes and looked at Su Li's face. He felt that it was somewhat familiar. Suddenly, he said coldly, "Li Qishao, I'll give you face and let them apologize." Li Xiaotong didn't answer. He just stood quietly to the side. After a while, Lin Dohai found that there was only silence. He looked back in surprise. He thought, "You're not the legitimate successor of the Li family. You were quite close to me before. I've already given you enough face. What else do you want?" "Li Qishao, I'll give you face and let them get out of the way. This matter will be over." In the silence, Su Lu suddenly said. However, even he felt that these words were somewhat awkward. Li Xiaotong's words were very pleasing to his ears. His usually gloomy face suddenly looked like a flower in the snow that had been washed by water. He smiled very gently and replied, "That's great. This bar belongs to one of my subordinates. I'll ask him to send you 2 bottles of good wine later." When the people on the stairs came down, Shang Qiu knew that the situation today was a little different. She had seen some children of rich families in the Federation, but she could clearly feel that the 2 young people on the other side today were obviously a level higher than those people. Whether it was the words or the information revealed in their actions, it all proved this point. So she fell silent. She wanted to see how Su Lu would handle this matter. But after this simple exchange, not only was Shang Qiu stunned, but Lin Dohai and his subordinates were also stunned. Lin Dohai said that he was giving face to Li Xiaotong, and Su Lu also said that he was giving face to Li Xiaotong. In truth, Li Xiaotong's last words were giving face to Su Lu. When had the descendants of the 7 great clans ever been so disrespected? Lin Dohai's face was so gloomy that it seemed like it would condense into ice. He coldly said, "Since that's the case, Li Xiaotong, don't blame me for not giving you face. That's too awkward. Face is earned by oneself, not given by others." Su Lu narrowed his eyes and expressed his opinion. He didn't pay attention to Lin Dohai, only looking at Uncle Kong behind him, who seemed to be facing a great enemy. He asked, "How have you been recently?" Kong Wu naturally wouldn't answer. His eyes had long since been fixed on the delicate man behind Su Lu. He didn't know when this man had slipped over, but he was even more aware of the terrifying strength of these 2 young people in front of him. If a conflict were to break out at this time, he simply wouldn't be able to protect his young master. So he walked over to Lin Dohai and whispered a few words. Lin Dohai's expression slightly changed. Only now did he recall that wine party in Gongdu. Associating it with the scene of that day, an unprecedented anger welled up in his heart. But this was, after all, Li Xiaotong's territory. Since the other party had already spoken and he didn't want to shed all pretense of cordiality, he could only wait until after the matter was over. Su Lu said to Li Xiaotong, "Where's Brother Zhang?" Li Xiaotong smiled bitterly. "I'll tell you in 2 days." Watching the man and woman leave, Lin Dohai was silent for a long time at the top of the stairs. He turned his head to look coldly at Li Xiaotong and said, "Don't you have anything to say?" Li Xiaotong glanced at him indifferently. He didn't need to explain anything, but he knew that this person had remembered Su Lu. In order to help Su Lu reduce some of the trouble, he opened his mouth and said, "He is Su Lu." Su Lu. Lin Dohai repeated this name silently in his heart, thinking that he understood Li Xiaotong's fear. The inside story of the mecha battle had been sealed, but it couldn't stop existences like the 7 great families from finding out the details. In his impression, this was an even crazier fellow who had forced Madman Li to call him uncle. Li Xiaotong ignored him and walked up the stairs, a cold smile on his lips. He thought to himself, the girl you wanted to force up to drink with is probably Shang Qiu from Nutshell. Even your family's Dean Lin was flipped over by this woman, so what do you count for? Lin Dohai stood where he was, unmoving. With the mention of Su Li's name, he thought of many things, including the commotion caused by the mecha battle a few days ago. The double humiliation made it impossible for him to stay in this bar any longer. Especially when he thought of that quiet girl who had been watching this scene from upstairs, he felt even more furious. He stormed off with his subordinates in a huff. Dohai still has a childish temper. I hope he can change it after marriage, said Li Xiaotong as he looked at the quiet girl on the sofa. My engagement with him has already been annulled, but he came to school to see me today. After all, we've known each other since we were young. Plus he knew you were here too, so I didn't reject him. But I didn't expect him to lose his composure like this. The quiet girl gently brushed her fluffy black hair, a trace of sadness in her beautiful eyes. It was Nan Xiangmei. Annulled? When did this happen? Li Xiaotong frowned. The annulment of the marriage alliance between the Lin family and the Nan family was naturally a big deal. Why hadn't there been any news about it? Nan Xiangmei didn't want to explain these personal matters, and it was even more inconvenient to say that Lin Banshan had boarded the train in the middle of the night. After all, this wasn't a glorious story for the two families. She gently blinked her eyes and suddenly asked curiously, the person downstairs was Su Lu, right? Are you familiar with him? You know Su Lu? Li Xiaotong was surprised again. He felt that Su Lu was a person he couldn't see through. How could an ordinary Federation citizen seem to know people from the 7 great families? Nan Xiangmei sat quietly and said softly, I guess you can say that. Then she nodded vigorously, as if she wanted to use this cute action to express her confirmation of this matter. I met him on the train. Nan Xiangmei smiled, revealing her pearly white teeth. She wasn't familiar with Li Xiaotong, but she found that he seemed to know that person. He's an engineer from Nutshell. How do you know him? Li Xiaotong's hand that was holding the wine glass slightly stiffened. He thought of the racing in the suburbs of Wangdu, and the knife light in the ivy garden. He couldn't help but laugh at himself and said softly, he's the biggest investment I've made in my life, and from the looks of it, it should be a steady profit. Li Xiaotong and Su Li's private dealings couldn't be hidden from the eagle-like eyes of the family elders. Li Xiaotong subdued the master invited by the family, Brother Zeng. But now Brother Zeng was transferred away. This should be a warning from the family to him. However, 7th young Master Li wasn't worried about this. Su Lu, whom he invested in, had begun to stand out in the Federation and shine. A firm calculator was a businessman. He would never place all his resources on one planet, and he would never place all his chips on one side of the planet. Just like a hedge fund, Li Xiaotong had invested in Su Lu a long time ago. After the battle with Ka Qifeng, this vision was bound to be praised by the family, although Su Lu had an extremely bad impact on the family's affairs. Nan Xiangmei looked at him, who was lost in thought. She gathered her courage and asked softly with a slightly red face, Can you tell me his contact information? Li Xiaotong, who had always been calm and even gloomy, was dumbfounded when he heard this request. Didn't you say you knew each other? It turned out that you just met by chance, but now you want Su Li's contact information? Although Li Xiaotong now considered himself and Su Lu as friends, he still felt that life was unfair. A guy who used to be a soldier made Zhou Yu, whom he and Madman Li both liked, pregnant, and now seduced the daughter of the Nan family, who had the strictest upbringing among the 7 families. How could he summon the courage to chase after her? Chapter 264. Under the influence of the Tai family, the successful development of the MX mecha named Little White Flower was a product of the collaboration between the Tai family and Su Lu. Lady Tai had never doubted the performance of the MX mecha, because she was the only person in the Federation who knew Su Li's true background. She had great confidence in that person. Lady Tai had only started to worry after the Federal Academy of Science had conscripted Li Feng. However, When she found out through secret channels that Sulu had personally piloted the mecha into battle, her worry faded a little. After all, she had lived with that person for so many years. Suli's final victory in this lady's eyes was a matter of course. Everything was still because she had an indescribable absolute trust in the strength of that old friend of hers. Right? The pearl-like white bubbles appeared evenly in the ginkgo porridge. The porridge was slightly green in color and looked appetizing. The heat was just right. Lady Tai filled 2 bowls and took one for herself. She started tasting it in the spacious kitchen. She also knew about the bet between Sulu and Madman Li in the assembly base. As she cooked the porridge, Lady Tai thought that according to that person's seniority Li Feng, that little tyrant calling Sulu uncle was really something very normal. Madam, young Master Lindohai just called. He happened to be in the capital recently and wants to visit you on behalf of the family, Butler Jean said respectfully. Butler Jean said respectfully at the door. Most people in the Federation who wanted to contact the wife of the head of the Tai family had to go through Great Secretary Shan. Only the members of the 7 great families who had coexisted for countless years would go through Butler Jean. I'm not in a good mood recently. I don't want to see guests. Lady Tai gently blew on the hot porridge in the bowl and said with a smile, if those old guys in the Lin family can figure out when they only have Lin Banshan to rely on in their family, I'm very willing to meet Lin Banshan. Butler Jean understood the meaning behind Madame Jin's words. Naturally, he also knew how to reply to her call later. Lady Tai had indeed been in a bad mood for the past 2 days. Matters such as the presidential election and the standards of the new mecha did not cause her mood to fluctuate too much. Over the past 10 years or so, she had maintained a good personal friendship with each successive president. Just this point alone was enough to give her the right to treat everything in the Federation lightly. What made her feel a little unhappy was the accusation of plagiarism by the Nutshell Engineering Department against the Federal Academy of Science in the Ground Command Hall. The plagiarism incident had caused many people in the government and the management committee to feel dissatisfied. They felt that the Federation was unable to provide an explanation to the public. These people all felt that Lady Tai was behind this incident, and in the end these feelings were all projected onto the Tai family. Lady Tai didn't care about the politicians' complaints, because no one dared to complain to her face. However, Sulu and Shangqiu didn't report this to Jose, which made the whole thing too passive. Regardless of how this incident would benefit the Tai family, the first thing that came to her mind was that the young man didn't respect her enough. Although Lin Yuanhu had always been independent of the Lin family, he was still a member of the Lin family. In recent years, there had been very few important people who could stand up for themselves. Just like that, he had been ruined by Sulu. Previously, when Lin Daohai wanted to visit her, it was naturally also a careful test by the Lin family. Madam, what orders do you have for me? Secretary Shen walked in from outside. Seeing Madame Jean and Butler Jean eating porridge in the kitchen, he was slightly stunned. He had been in this manner for some time now. He roughly understood that there was still a long time before he could eat the porridge personally cooked by Madame Jean. Give Bryn a call. Lady Tai wiped her hands on her apron and casually ordered. The plagiarism incident in the Academy of Science was not a scandal that the upper echelons of the Federation wanted to see. However, strangely enough, President Seek had no intention of suppressing this incident. She was very curious about this, so she asked Shunli to contact the deputy director of the president's office. Yes. Secretary Shen continued, there will be a live broadcast of the election debate in 6 days. I have made some arrangements for the news channel. Lady Tai waved her hand and stopped him from reporting. She said, I trust you to handle this matter. Since that little fellow Sulu had already rudely and insidiously overturned Lin Yuanhu, Lady Tai could only take advantage of this situation to gain more benefits. Senator Pabre's campaign office had been keeping quiet about this incident. However, the Tai family's influence on the media had already been highlighted. Lady Tai couldn't help but frown when she recalled Senator Pabre's deep voice and very direct rejection during the phone call today. She had never dreamed of being able to control a president, but she always felt that Senator Pabre was a little too independent. However, Pabre was someone who was going to be the president in the future, so Lady Tai would give him enough respect. However, she wouldn't treat Sulu the same way. What an unruly fellow, said Lady Tai in her heart. The most important thing in the Federation was rules. Sulu had been too unruly in this incident. Lady Tai thought silently as she mixed the green porridge. She decided to give this young man another chance for now, and there wouldn't be a next time. Secrecy, silence, no one cared about him. The invisible pressure in the air from all directions caused the battle on Kaki Peak to not bring any substantial benefits to Sulu. He didn't know that Lady Tai was doing this to protect his safety, but she was also warning him, because he hadn't considered these two aspects at all. Would using the simulation system expose his identity as a fugitive? In the moment when his mind was filled with emotions, Sulu would not consider this point at all. As for the warning, he had already obtained what he wanted the most from the Mecha Standards competition, a victory in both logic and spirit. That was enough to satisfy him, not to mention that he had a friend now. Loneliness was a kind of illness. Sulu had always thought so, but he was often plagued by this illness. His closest family and friends had all disappeared in the vast universe, in the tide of people that was even wider than the universe for some reason. So when he received Shang Qiu's call at the entrance of the West Mountain compound, he agreed without hesitation. This female engineer with a genius brain and full breasts had already become one of his most trusted companions in these past few days. The black car without a logo arrived at the bar in the southern entrance of the capital's special administrative region at 10 p.m. Capital University was near the southern entrance. This was a rare social university that didn't need to be built in Linhai. The streets around the bar were filled with beautiful girls wearing short trench coats. The bar's decor was extremely high-end. Sulu couldn't understand it, but he roughly understood that this place was at least much more high-end than those nightclubs in Donglin. Soft dance music mixed with an obscure rhythm. Although there were many people in the bar, because the area was too big, it didn't seem crowded. Young men and women gently swayed their bodies to the dance music. Dazzling geometric lights swept across the entire bar, occasionally mixing to form a three-dimensional star pattern full of a sense of space, branded on those youthful and restless bodies. Cheers! Several round glasses filled with strong alcohol were raised and lightly clinked, completely unable to suppress the happy shouts of the crowd. Other than Shang Qiu, there were also a few members of the technical team who had stayed behind in the capital who had come to attend this party. These engineers, who usually looked quiet and wooden, appeared much more relaxed than usual because of the successful development of the MX Mecha. In less than half an hour, they had already downed several bottles of good alcohol and were beginning to slurp their words. Back in the Harbor City Industrial Park, Sulu and his colleagues in the engineering department had only communicated through the internal network. But later on, after a series of meetings, they had quickly become familiar with one another. Sitting together was quite comfortable, but hearing the praises of those engineers, Sulu couldn't help but feel a little embarrassed. Emboldened by the alcohol, the engineers walked towards the dance floor, preparing to get close to those young girls swaying their youthful bodies. Sulu looked at them with a glass of wine in hand, and couldn't help but smile. He asked, "I remember that some of you seem to be married already. Married is about the same as not being married. After the failure of last year's experiment, everyone has basically been living in the engineering department. They rarely have time to go home," Shang Qiu replied, lying lazily on the densely woven sofa. Perhaps it was because she had drunk some alcohol, but Shang Qiu wasn't wearing those square spectacles. Her legs were pressed under her, and her body was leaning against the sofa, which made her ample bosom appear even more conspicuous. Today she was wearing a very casual shirt. Inside the shirt was a light green tube top. Her snow-white skin peeked out from the opening of the shirt. Even in the dim bar it was still so dazzling. Sulu turned his head. Seeing the moving scenery in front of Shang Qiu's chest, he was momentarily stunned. He thought back to the moment when he had turned on the video feed for the first time in the engineering department's basement, and also the dumbfounded expressions of Lan Xiaolong and Zhou Yu standing behind him. This is a bit too big. He sighed in his heart. Under the influence of Uncle Fengyu, Sulu definitely couldn't be considered a gentleman. However, after all, he hadn't experienced too many things between a man and a woman. With a trace of nostalgia, he turned his head away, not daring to be blinded by the soft white skin. He called by Yulan. After confirming that the Bureau of Proclamation didn't make things difficult for him, he felt a lot more relaxed. He asked Shang Qiu and told her to come to this bar for a few drinks. Of course I don't have any objections, Shangqiu said. Your secretary Bai has actually done a lot for MX. You and I both know that. She paused, then suddenly raised the glass in her hand very seriously and said, Sulu, thank you. What's there to thank me for? Sulu said sincerely. He gently touched her glass and said, I just want to take back what originally belonged to me. Speaking of which, on behalf of Professor Shin and myself, I really want to thank you for what you said in the command center. The two sat next to each other. Sulu looked at Shangqiu's black and messy hair and realized that without glasses, she looked more beautiful and soft than usual. However, he felt a little awkward where his gaze landed, so he used his finger to point in the air. Shangqiu followed his finger and looked down. She smiled. In fact, she usually paid a lot of attention to what she wore. If it weren't for the fact that they were in a relaxing place like a bar, and in a semi-enclosed private booth space, she definitely wouldn't have unbuttoned her outer shirt. However, she didn't expect Sulu to be so uneasy. Don't tell me you're still a virgin? Shangqiu didn't button up her shirt. Instead, she blinked and asked with great interest. The light was blurred, and there was a lingering fragrance in the glass. The woman beside him said a bold and direct sentence. Sulu felt his face heat up. He raised his glass and didn't answer. In the quiet bar, there were occasional small disturbances, but they quickly subsided. Why did you choose this bar? It's all young people playing here. Under the influence of alcohol, it's easy to have problems. Sulu looked at the small stage in the depths of the bar. On the stage, there was a girl wearing a light blue skin-tight suit. She was singing and dancing to the music, exuding a faint blurred smell. The bar's decoration was very good. The design was very modern and charming, but it always looked like a place where young people should be. Aren't you a young person? Shangqiu looked at him curiously. She didn't understand how she could hear such an old man's words from his mouth. Sulu was slightly stunned. He realized that there was probably a problem with his mentality. He smiled and covered it up. Not long after, Bai Yulan walked into the bar and found the booth where everyone was sitting. When the two of them met, they didn't say much. They took a glass of wine and drank it in one gulp. A lock of black hair fell between Bai Yulan's eyebrows. He habitually lowered his head and filled Suli's glass with wine. Then, he raised his head and thought about the scene he saw at the old moon base. He said softly, Boss, I've been thinking about it these past 2 days. You gave me $20 million. Do you want me to refund you some money? Sulu gave Bai Yulan the bank card not because he wanted to buy a horse with $1,000. It was because he had never thought of forming an anti-government organization in a social environment like the Federation. He just needed a capable and reliable helper by his side. In the original plan, Bai Yulan, as the Federation's most familiar pilot with MX, could help him develop it smoothly. He could also participate in the mecha battle. However, Sulu personally went to the mecha battle. In his normal work life, there weren't many places where he could use Bai Yulan. That was why Bai Yulan said those words. What's wrong? Sulu didn't think of this and asked in surprise. The slow rhythm in the bar, but the sound effects were not muffled. They covered the two people's conversation. Bai Yulan laughed lightly and said, Other than making the bed, pouring tea, and killing people, I don't seem to have much use for you. At this time, Shangqiu was already drunk. She didn't pay attention to what they were talking about. She buttoned up her shirt and walked out of the booth, preparing to go to the washroom. Sulu looked at her and couldn't help but laugh. Shangqiu's white shirt buttons were done wrongly, which made her chest look even more exaggerated. Only now did he understand that women with amazing figures would attract the attention of others no matter what they wore. Sometimes attracting attention wasn't a good thing. Shangqiu swayed her way through the bar. The bar patrons all noticed this woman with a unique temperament and mesmerizing chest. Luckily, the waters of the Capital Special District were too murky. This bar beside the Capital University was also a well-known place that Shangqiu had specially chosen. Although she attracted the attention of countless burning gazes, no one dared to approach her. After working together for so long, Sulu knew that Shangqiu was not someone to be trifled with. Plus, there were so many companions in the bar, so he wasn't too worried about her safety. Instead, he was worried that she would pass out drunk when she reached the washroom. He looked in that direction worriedly, and after informing Bai Yulan, he followed her. Chapter 265. There would always be many cliché stories repeated in a bar, especially when a woman like Shang Qiu, who had the ability to cause a commotion, passed by. However, Sulu always thought that he was not qualified to compete with others for a woman's affection, so the heavens would not arrange such a cliché story for him. But just as he walked a few steps out of the booth, he saw Shang Qiu snatch a glass of wine from the bar beside her and splash it directly on someone's face. Sulu was slightly shocked. He rushed to Shang Qiu's side and held her arm. It was slightly cold to the touch, and the back of his hand was tender and smooth. It was quite moving. "Are you okay?" He did not have time to see who was on the other side of the conflict. He lowered his head and asked Shang Qiu, "Did someone reach out to you?" "I'm not drunk." Shang Qiu frowned, but she did not know that she had buttoned the wrong button on her shirt. She waved her hand and said, "No one reached out. It's just that this guy said something about a young master wanting to treat me to a drink. His tone was very annoying." Sulu was slightly startled. He turned around and saw a middle-aged man wiping the wine off his face. Looking at the middle-aged man's attire, he should be a powerful figure in the Federation. However, he was only inviting her on behalf of someone else. He did not know who the person behind this was. He didn't ask Shang Qiu how annoying that person's tone was, because they were engineers in their bones, and they were somewhat incompatible with this society. Some people with power and money were probably used to looking down on others and using frivolity to represent their strength, but Shang Qiu were not used to it. Of course, Sulu was not worried that he would not be able to clean up the mess later. Although his role in the development of MX was forcefully suppressed by the government, Shang Qiu and the Nutshell Engineering Department's contributions were already set in stone. From a certain perspective, Shang Qiu was now a hero of the Federation. At this time, who would be foolish enough to provoke her? Even if they made a scene in public, they would only be at a disadvantage. "I just want to invite this lady up for a drink on behalf of my young master. I don't know why I was treated so rudely," the middle-aged man standing not far away said angrily as he wiped the wine off his face. Sulu knew the details of the matter, so naturally, he could not answer. He looked up and saw that in the luxurious bar on the second floor of the bar, there were a few young people in luxurious clothes whispering softly. They would turn their heads from time to time, as if they were commenting on him or Shang Qiu. His eyes narrowed as he recognized one of the faces. He also found that the back of the person who was facing him was somewhat familiar. For a moment he couldn't help but feel a little confused. Although this bar was the most famous high-end nightclub next to Capital University, with the identity of the young man's family, he shouldn't have come to such a place. He didn't want to cause trouble, but he wouldn't torture himself to apologize to the middle-aged man in front of him. He was about to leave with Shang Qiu when Shang Qiu said with a slightly red face, "I'm in a hurry." Sulu immediately remembered this matter and walked forward with her. He was used to seeing Shang Qiu's strange appearance mixed with the spirit of an engineer. It was rare to see her blushing, so it was quite enjoyable. The middle-aged man clearly did not expect that this pair would walk away like he was nothing. Not only did they not apologize, they did not even say a word of apology. When Sulu and Shang Qiu returned, there were a few more people blocking their way. "It's really cliché," Shang Qiu said with a wink. Sulu had joked about this kind of cliché on the way here. The bar was very large, so not many people would notice the commotion here. Even if they did, they would be blocked out of the area by people who came from who knew where. Sulu narrowed his eyes and looked at the people in front of him. He was not surprised that they would bring so many people to drink. After all, they were the children of aristocratic families. It was rare for them to experience the hardships of the common people, so they had to be extra careful about their safety. At this time, a very calm voice came from above the isolated quiet area. "It's fine if you don't drink, but it's not good for you to be like a shrew when you're so pretty. You should at least apologize to my people." Some people thought that they were elegant and calm, so they could act like they were hiding a needle in a velvet glove, but they did not know that these words were really asking for a beating. Sulu looked at the magnolia flower who was quietly approaching. He heard Shang Qiu yell, "I want to apologize to your mother." Shang Qiu was 24 years old this year. She worked in the underground of the Nutshell Engineering Department for many years. She rarely saw the sun, so her skin was as white as snow. Her beautiful face and exaggerated figure were indeed very eye-catching. However, when she said the word mother, it really revealed her character. As the technical director of the Nutshell Engineering Department, she was not just a beauty. The young man upstairs could not sit still. His face darkened and he walked down the stairs. A quiet girl in the luxurious compartment looked at him with a trace of helplessness in her eyes. Sulu looked at the young man walking down the stairs. His expression did not change, but when he saw Li Xiaotong who followed him downstairs, he could not help but feel that it was a small world. It turned out that the familiar figure upstairs was actually the seventh young master of the Li family. When Li Xiaotong saw Sulu, he could not help but be slightly startled. He immediately showed a bitter smile and said, "Dohai, don't mess around. This is my friend." It was a rare scene for two of the second generation of the seven great families to appear in this bar. The one who had asked his subordinates to invite Shang Qiu upstairs to drink was Lin Dohai. Lin Dohai's trip was originally to visit Lady Tai in the back mountain of Macho, according to his family's intention. However, he was coldly refused. He had to stay in the capital for a few days to see what happened. The Li and Lin families had been close in recent years. Li Qishao, who was in the capital, naturally had to do the reception work. However, Lin Dohai did not want to go to those quiet clubs. He asked to come to the bar near the capital university. Lin Dohai made this choice because the quiet girl was studying at the capital university. He had invited Shang Qiu upstairs because he liked Shang Qiu's hot body. He wanted to vent his anger on the quiet girl. However, he did not expect that the girl with the impressive figure seemed to have a strong background. Not only did she splash wine on his subordinates, but she was also called a friend by Li Qishao. After a moment of silence, Lin Dohai narrowed his eyes and looked at Su Li's face, feeling that it was somewhat familiar. He suddenly opened his mouth and said coldly, "Seventh young master Li, I'll give you face and let them apologize." Li Xiaotong did not answer and just stood quietly on the side. After waiting for a while, he found that there was only silence around him. Lin Dohai looked back in surprise. "You're not the legitimate successor of the Li family, and you were quite close to me before. I've already given you enough face. What else do you want?" "Li Qishao, I will give you face and let them get out of the way. This matter will be over." In the silence, Sulu suddenly opened his mouth. However, even he felt that these words were somewhat awkward. Li Xiaotong's words were very pleasing to his ears. His usually gloomy face suddenly looked like a flower in the snow that had been washed by water. He smiled very gently and replied, "That's great. This bar belongs to one of my men. I'll ask him to send you 2 bottles of good wine later." When the people came down the stairs, Shang Qiu knew that today's situation was somewhat different. She had seen some children of rich families in the Federation. However, she could clearly feel that the 2 young people today were obviously a level higher than those people. Whether it was their words or the information revealed in their actions, they all proved this. Thus she fell silent, wanting to see how Sulu planned to handle this matter. But after these 2 or 3 simple words, not only was Shang Qiu stunned, but Lin Dohai and his subordinates were also astonished. Lin Dohai said that he was giving face to Li Xiaotong and Sulu also said that he was giving face to Li Xiaotong. In truth, Li Xiaotong's last words were giving face to Sulu. When had the children of the 7 great families ever been so disrespected? Lin Dohai's face was so gloomy that it seemed like it would condense into ice. He coldly said, "Since that's the case, Li Xiaotong, don't blame me for not giving you face. That's too awkward. Face is earned by oneself, not given by others." Sulu narrowed his eyes and expressed his opinion. He didn't pay attention to Lin Dohai and only looked at Uncle Kong behind him, who seemed to be facing a great enemy. He asked, "How have you been recently?" Kong Wu naturally wouldn't answer. His eyes had long been fixed on the delicate man behind Sulu. He didn't know when this man had snuck over, but he also knew how terrifying the strength of these 2 young people was. If a conflict were to break out at this time, he simply couldn't guarantee the safety of his young master. Thus he walked over to Lin Dohai and softly said a few words. Lin Dohai's expression slightly changed. Only now did he recall the wine party in Gongdu, and associate it with the scene of that day. An unprecedented anger welled up in his heart, but this was Li Qishao's territory. Since the other party had already spoken and he didn't want to shed all pretense of cordiality, he could only wait until after the matter was over. Su Lu said to Li Xiaotong, "Where's Brother Zhang?" Li Xiaotong smiled bitterly and said, "I'll tell you in 2 days." Watching the man and woman leave, Lin Dohai was silent for a long time at the top of the stairs. He turned his head to look coldly at Li Xiaotong and said, "Don't you have anything to say?" Li Xiaotong glanced at him indifferently. He didn't need to explain anything, but he knew that this person had remembered Su Lu. In order to help Su Lu reduce some of the trouble, he opened his mouth and said, "He is Su Lu." Su. Lin Dohai repeated this name silently in his heart, thinking that he understood Li Xiaotong's fear. The inside story of the mecha battle had been sealed, but it couldn't stop existences like the 7 great families from finding out the details. In his impression, this was an even crazier person who had forced Madman Li to call him uncle. Li Xiaotong ignored him and walked up the stairs, a cold smile on his lips. He thought to himself, the girl you wanted to force up to drink with is probably Shang Qiu from Nutshell. Even your family's Dean Lin was flipped over by this woman, so who do you think you are? Lin Dohai stood where he was, unmoving. With the mention of Su Li's name, he thought of many things, including the commotion caused by the mecha battle a few days ago. The double humiliation made it impossible for him to stay in this bar any longer, especially when he thought of that quiet girl who had been watching this scene from upstairs. He felt even more furious, and he left with his subordinates in a huff. Dohai still has a childish temper. I hope he can change it after marriage, said Li Xiaotong as he looked at the quiet girl on the sofa. My engagement with him has already been annulled, but he came to school to see me today. After all, we've known each other since we were young, and he knew you were here too, so I didn't reject him. I didn't expect him to lose his composure like this. The quiet girl gently brushed her fluffy black hair, a trace of sadness in her beautiful eyes. It was Nan Xiangmei. Annulled? When did this happen? Li Xiaotong frowned. The annulment of the marriage between the Lin family and the Nan family was naturally a big deal, but why hadn't there been any news about it? Nan Xiangmei didn't want to explain these personal matters, and it was even more inconvenient to say that Lin Banshan had boarded the train in the middle of the night. After all, this wasn't a glorious story for the 2 families. She gently blinked her eyes and suddenly asked curiously, the one downstairs was Su Lu, right? Are you familiar with him? You know Su Lu? Li Xiaotong was surprised again. He felt that Su Lu was a person he couldn't see through. Why did an ordinary Federation citizen seem to know everyone in the circle of the 7 great families? Nan Xiangmei sat quietly and said softly, I guess you can say that I know him. Then she nodded vigorously, as if she wanted to use this cute action to express her confirmation of this matter. I met him on the train. Nan Xiangmei smiled, revealing her pearly white teeth. She wasn't familiar with Li Xiaotong, but she found that he seemed to know that person. He's an engineer from Nutshell. How do you know him? Li Xiaotong's hand that was holding the wine glass slightly stiffened. He thought of the racing in the suburbs of Wangdu, and the knife light in the ivy garden. He couldn't help but laugh at himself and said softly, he's the biggest investment I've made in my life, and from what I see now, it should be a steady profit. Li Xiaotong and Su Li's private dealings couldn't be hidden from the eagle-like eyes of the family elders. Li Xiaotong subdued the master invited by the family, Brother Zhang. But now Brother Zhang was transferred away. This should be a warning from the family to him, but 7th young Master Li wasn't worried about this. Su Lu, whom he invested in, had begun to stand out and shine in the Federation. A firm calculator was a businessman. He would never place all his resources on one planet, and he would never place all his chips on one side of the planet. Just like a hedge fund, Li Xiaotong had invested in Su Lu a long time ago. After the battle with Ka Qifeng, this vision was bound to be praised by the family, although Su Lu had an extremely bad impact on the family's affairs. Nan Xiangmei looked at him, who was lost in thought. She gathered her courage and asked softly with a slightly red face, Can you tell me his contact information? Li Xiaotong, who had always been calm and even a little gloomy, was dumbfounded when he heard this request. Didn't you say that you knew each other? It turned out that you just met by chance, but now you want Su Li's contact information? Although Li Xiaotong now thought that he and Su Lu were friends, he still felt that life was unfair. A guy who used to be a soldier made Zhou Yu whom he and Madmanly both liked, pregnant, and now seduced the daughter of the Nan family, who had the strictest upbringing among the 7 families. How could he summon the courage to chase after her? Chapter 266. It's not that I'm a troublemaker, Shangqiu angrily explained to her companions. She buttoned up her shirt and waved her hand. I don't usually dress like this. That day in the command hall, you all saw how solemn and serious I was dressed. The engineers of the technical team hurriedly nodded. Sulu scratched his head and said with a smile, but I remember that you wore even less than this in the engineering department. Shangqiu knew that he was talking about the video. She chuckled and said, I never thought of myself as a woman in the engineering department, because these guys are not men in my eyes. The members of the technical team all nodded with a bitter face. They thought that only after working together for a long time could they know how perverted and strict this woman's requirements were. After the party was over, Sulu drove Shangqiu back to the hotel. Looking at the road ahead, he explained, the person who invited you to drink today is the young master of the Lin family, one of the 7 major families. Shangqiu was slightly stunned. Her eyes moved as if they could speak. Looking at his profile, she shook her head and sighed. I know that you have connections with the Ministry of National Defense. Otherwise, that perverted major of the 8384 unit would not be responsible for protecting you in Harbor City. But I didn't expect that you have connections with all the major families in the Federation. Sula shrugged and said, it's just something that happened in the past 2 years. I feel a bit confused. Hehe, are you jealous of me? Do you want me to introduce you to some of the young masters of the major families? Speaking of which, the young masters of the major families are usually well educated. People like Lin Daohai are rare. Forget it. 7 major families? Shangqiu burped, unable to hide the feeling of drunkenness in her head, and closed her eyes. In the autumn of the capital, the streets and alleys in the middle of the night had not snowed yet. The automatic heating and snow removal system under the ground was naturally not activated. Therefore, the surroundings were quiet. The wind blew the yellow leaves on the quiet sidewalk. Sulu subconsciously rolled down the window. He didn't want the thick bulletproof and soundproof glass to block out the rustling sound of the withered leaves on the ground. Rustle, rustle. This was the sound of autumn. Sulu listened to it happily, his hands firmly gripping the steering wheel. In Donglin, where there was no distinction between the 4 seasons, the smell of autumn could only be felt in prose anthologies. The cold air blew in through the window. His face was slightly cold and he shivered. However, he felt refreshed. Immediately, he remembered that there was someone beside him. He immediately closed the window and looked out of the corner of his eye. Shangqiu quietly leaned on the chair with a trace of exhaustion and relaxation on her face. Her sparse eyelashes, the tip of her nose, slightly pouted lips, and smooth chin formed an exquisite line. The seatbelt was tightly fastened on the girl's body, causing her bulging breasts to sink in. Sulu didn't have any thoughts of lust. He just looked at her quietly. He knew how tired she had been over the past few years because of MX. It was probably only on nights like this that she could truly relax. Since he was young, his goal had been to become a top mechanic in the Federation. Now he was walking on this path. Beside him, Shangqiu was undoubtedly someone worthy of his respect. At such a young age, she had already achieved something that many engineers could never achieve in their lifetime. He turned back to drive. Shangqiu slowly woke up. She looked at Su Li's side profile with blurry eyes, thinking about where this guy came from. In her heart, something similar to Su Li's previous thoughts surged out. She was also a fanatic worshipper of technology. In the past few days of working together, she had been shocked by Su Li's overflowing design concepts. She was even more shocked by his genius idea to solve the Z4. She didn't know the secrets in Su Li's mind, so this young man seemed even more mysterious and powerful in her heart. You're awake, Sulu said. The black car drove on the quiet night streets of the capital. After a moment of silence, Shangqiu suddenly asked, do you have a girlfriend? Sulu was silent for a moment. His voice was a little hoarse as he replied, no. Shangqiu looked out the window and suddenly laughed. She looked at herself in the mirror and thought that she was still a few years older than him. Moreover, she had never thought about the matters between men and women. Why would she suddenly ask such a funny personal question? What about you? Sulu asked. I don't have one either. Shangqiu rested her face on her hand and looked at him quietly. She said, I look down on men in the Federation, but you're an exception. Suli's heart skipped a beat. His palms on the steering wheel were sweating. However, Shangqiu immediately smiled and said, unfortunately, a little virgin like you is too mysterious. I just want to quietly stay in the engineering department. Although it was a joking explanation, it vaguely pointed out something. Suli's young heart felt like it had been frozen. It was not to describe cold disappointment, but to describe a crisp, cool, and very comfortable feeling. Suli's face was a little hot. He did not understand why the girl with the impressive figure beside him would say such a thing. This time you've made a great contribution to the company, or rather to the Federation. Although I don't understand why the board of directors hasn't made any moves yet. Shangqiu looked at Sulu with interest. She found that the boy was avoiding her gaze. She found it more and more interesting. However, she did not want to embarrass Sulu too much, so she changed the topic. What are your plans for the future? The warm car, the hot girl, and the soft breasts that could kill eyes. Sulu looked ahead. He could also feel an ambiguous atmosphere pervading the air. When he heard this, he immediately let out a sigh of relief and replied, what plans can I have? I'll probably go back to Whitewater first. My file is still there. Do you want me to transfer you to the engineering department? Although Mr. Jose was angry at the command center that day, he would definitely want you to go over. The board of directors would probably promote you directly to level 1 technical supervisor. Shangqiu sat up straight and placed her hands calmly on her smooth thighs. She calmed the trace of uneasiness in her heart and smiled calmly as she spoke. The Shell Motor Company was a giant company that prioritized technology above all else. There was an independent technical director on the board of directors, and below that was a level 3 technical supervisor system. Level 1 technical supervisors were usually important figures in the various large companies under them. Because of Shangqiu's ability in mecha design in the engineering department, she had only been acting as level 1 technical supervisor for half a year. However, given the huge impact Sulu had played in the development of the MX mecha this time, it was not unthinkable for them to make an exception and promote him to level 1 technical supervisor. The problem was, he knew very well that his future in the Federation company had always been under the watch of Lady Tai, so he could not say anything. The black car stopped outside the Cloud Queen Hotel. Sulu stared at the display on the car's radar, and only relaxed after confirming that no one from Lin Daohai's side was following them. This was a high-class hotel of the federal military. Shangqiu and the technical team were staying here. Even if Lin Daohai had the guts as big as the sky, he would not dare to come and cause trouble here. Before getting out of the car, Shangqiu suddenly turned around and hugged Sulu tightly. She planted a big kiss on his face and said, "Don't think too much. I just want to thank you." Sulu was stunned for a moment. Feeling the softness on his face and the fullness and softness of her breasts, he was completely speechless. By the time he returned to the apartment in Wangdu district, it was already past 2 a.m. After drinking, Sulu felt a little thirsty, but he did not have the desire to sleep. He opened a bottle of purified water, leaned comfortably on the sofa, and stared blankly at the television. Sulu knew that his cooperation with the engineering department had ended. Perhaps in the years to come, he would not have the opportunity to work closely with those engineers again. Perhaps it would be very difficult to see Shangqiu again in the future. Therefore, when he thought of the gathering in the bar earlier and the hug before parting, he felt a little nostalgic. It had been a long time since he had such intimate contact with the opposite sex. Sulu narrowed his eyes as he watched the Federation TV Awards ceremony, and said to himself in his heart, at his age it should have been the time of youth and yearning for spring. However, when he thought about the relationship between a man and a woman, he would think of that pair of black-rimmed glasses and that ball of fireworks that disappeared in the atmosphere of S2. His heart would ache, so he refused to think about it. Before he had been partying, but now he was lonely. Sulu sat alone on the sofa without moving. His feet were on the coffee table, and the metallic phone was by his feet. Just like him, he was silent and quiet. A night without anyone to contact was indeed difficult to get through. Lin Yuanhu had fallen, but many people in the Federation were still standing. There was not much that Sulu could do, but he wanted to see how things would develop. The TV was broadcasting the Federation Autumn Literary Awards. The star who had won the Best Female Lead in a Drama Series was hugging the award excitedly. She was sobbing uncontrollably. Then she smiled faintly and said, "This is really an exciting year. The results of the presidential election are not out yet, but I have already won the award." The celebrity audience below the stage laughed and applauded one after another. The beautiful curly-haired female star smiled and said, "Of course I have to thank many people. However, at this time, I should be thanking Jian Shuier for not signing up." Then the curly-haired female star said seriously, "I hope that nothing will stop us from admiring beautiful things. Jian Shuier, we will wait for your return." The audience applauded. Ever since the terrorist attack at the Huanshan 4 Prefecture's concert, the Federation Channel 23 TV series that was popular throughout the universe stopped broadcasting. Jian Shuier also disappeared from the screen. She had not appeared for a long time. Sulu watched the TV quietly. He thought about the idol of the Federation that he had almost forgotten. Thinking about his obsession back then, he felt that the progress of life was so fast that he could not react. In the past year, because he had been busy with many things, he had not watched TV for a long time. Thinking about this, he fell asleep quietly on the sofa. The simple security monitoring system around the apartment faithfully carried out its mission. When dawn broke, the phone on the coffee table that had been quiet all this time suddenly rang. Sulu rubbed his eyes and pulled back his somewhat numb legs. He saw that there was an email on the phone. The sender was a string of confidential asterisks. The email said, Chapter 267. In a remote industrial town surrounded by 4 mountainous states in the S2 sector, it was currently dusk. The warm twilight sun shone on the simple and crude buildings. The S2 planetary system had several of the Federation's most important resource planets, as well as the Federation's most developed heavy industrial base. Most of the Shell Motor Company's production lines were set up on this planet. The Federation's great industry flourished, and the disparity between the rich and the poor was especially evident on this planet. That was why Green Dragon Mountain, surrounded by 4 heavy industry provinces, produced a group of armed forces that dared to oppose the federal government. In the eyes of historians, this was an extremely natural matter. Although the Federation had been constantly passing legislation over the years to seek a balance between the interests of capitalists and workers, and had achieved a lot of results, the rise of George Carlinism in the Federation society brought a fatal blow to this attempt. The anti-government forces were besieged and suppressed for decades, but instead became stronger and stronger. Fortunately, in the past decade or so, the federal government had pursued a policy of combining military force with economic blockade, which had successfully curbed the development of the anti-government forces. It was only in recent years that the armed forces had been driven deep into the mountains and forests. Green Dragon Mountain was a large mountain range that spanned 2,000 kilometers. There were 4 large states surrounding this mountain range, and it was the base of the heavy industry of the Federation back then. The people who lived here were staunch supporters of Senator Macklin's nonviolent resistance, even if they did not support the anti-government army's idea of using force. Because of years of fighting and the Federation's strict blockade policy, the industrial areas near the Green Dragon Mountains had gradually become desolate, especially this industrial town, which showed signs of decay everywhere. Zhang Xiaoming, wearing a work outfit, walked out of the relay station's workshop. She smiled and greeted her colleagues who passed by her before walking back to her room. She had been in S2 for more than half a year. Under the arrangement of her leader, she entered the industrial town incognito. Nominally, the relay station was actually a hidden information node of the anti-government forces intelligence organization in the mountains, and she was the person in charge here. In the past half a year, Zhang Xiaoming experienced the terrorist attack at the concert, and also personally experienced several secret military encirclements by the government forces. Although the government did not admit to those small-scale encirclements, and the real executors were the 3 large security companies in the Federation, those battles of blood and fire, the deaths of her companions, and the torn flesh of her companions made her mature quickly. She was no longer the young girl who only knew her ideals. The treachery and cruelty of the Federation government taught her a lesson. It made her give up any illusions. Deep down, she began to doubt Senator Medellin's idea of nonviolence, as well as his idea of joining the Federation government. Was it a legitimate seizure of power, or was it a form of capitulation? This industrial town was the fourth location of the relay station that Zhang Xiaoming was in. The previous three had been mercilessly destroyed by the government's mercenaries. Many of her companions had died, but Zhang Xiaoming did not become numb to death. Instead, she became more serious in her work. She carefully and quickly combed through the information sent back from the capital, and then sent it to the mountains through a secret channel. In the canteen, Zhang Xiaoming bought a box of potatoes and beans. Along with white rice and accompanied by the sunset, she squatted by the forest and began to eat her dinner. From time to time, she would push her hair to the side. The black-rimmed glasses were no longer there. Her originally beautiful face was a little darker, but it also made her look healthier and more determined. The food was not delicious, but Zhang Xiaoming ate it with relish. This was because she knew that even this food was extremely difficult for the guerrillas under the Federation's strict blockade. After finishing the last mouthful of rice, before she could wash the dishes, she was called back. "Why are you here?" Zhang Xiaoming looked at the middle-aged man in front of her and asked in surprise. In the entire relay station, she was probably the only one who knew that this middle-aged man was the head of the intelligence organization of the anti-government army. He was called one of the 5 people worth learning from by the young master of the Tai family. "Have you sent the information?" "Yes," Zhang Xiaoming answered briskly. The middle-aged man was silent for a moment, then looked at Zhang Xiaoming and said, "You should have already seen my analysis. Behind the Federation's new Mecca, there is the issue of the presidential election. The organization has long been unable to control Senator Medellin, but you should know very well why Su Lu is involved in this matter." Zhang Xiaoming lowered her head and said softly, "I understand." The middle-aged man said, "The organization does not want a young person who sympathizes with the progressive forces to be in danger because of a misunderstanding like this. That is why they agreed to let you contact him and tell him that you are still alive." "Thank you," Zhang Xiaoming said. "Get ready. We are about to leave," he said with a serious expression. With a serious expression, he said, "The Federation's presidential election has reached a critical juncture. According to my understanding, some people in the Federation are about to launch an attack on Medellin. I think it's time for us to do something. What can we do?" Zhang Xiaoming asked seriously. "Do you have the courage to stand in the Hall of Congress in front of the countless millions of people in the Federation and accuse Medellin?" The middle-aged man looked quietly into Zhang Xiaoming's eyes and no misunderstanding, no story. However, life or the universe was born from countless misunderstandings. That little black dot from billions of years ago, perhaps because it had misunderstood its own restlessness, it exploded and released countless energy substances, creating time and shaping the long river of history. It allowed those intelligent life forms that were born by chance to act out scenes of misunderstandings, joys, and sorrows. Perhaps it was not a misunderstanding in the first place, but a lie. When Su Lu drove the black car to the Milky Way cemetery, he thought of the email he saw in the morning and thought about it. He gently hummed the tune of 27 glasses of wine as he drove the car briskly along the mountain road. He didn't seem to be angry at being deceived, because he didn't know that the email was sent by Zhang Xiaoming. He thought that some bad uncle knew that after he won the battle with Ka Qifeng, he could no longer hide behind the curtain and watch the show, so he took the initiative to contact him. After escaping from Eastwood to the capital ring, Su Lu had gradually discovered the relationship between Uncle Feng Yu and the Lees of Philadelphia, as well as the vague truth of the matter. He had already confirmed that Uncle Feng Yu was a very amazing person. Even the big explosion back then did not kill him, so how did he die 2 years ago? When they parted on the outskirts of Heshi State, Uncle Feng Yu gave him the metal bracelet and told him not to think about avenging himself. In addition, Su Lu had recently been convinced that the fierce Uncle Feng Yu must still be alive in some corner of the universe, so he naturally thought that the email was sent by Uncle Feng Yu. Knowing that the uncle was still alive, Su Li's heart did not have the slightest anger of being lied to. There was only joy bursting out from the depths of his heart. With this rich joy or even ecstasy, he drove the black car into the Milky Way cemetery. Holding a bouquet of flowers, he walked to a quiet corner in the depths of the cemetery. Looking at the 3 words, Shenyulan, carved on the black stone, Su Li's face did not show any sadness. He just quietly crouched down, plucked the fallen leaves on the black stone, and placed the flowers on it. Uncle Feng Yu and Professor Shen were the 2 most important teachers in his career as a mechanic. Although he had not spent much time with Professor Shen in terms of feelings, Su Lu was definitely much closer to Feng Yu. However, the trust Professor Shen had placed in him before he passed away made him feel incomparably warm. The uncle was still alive, and the core data left behind by Professor Shen had helped the Federation successfully develop the MX Mecha. All these happy things gathered together. In this past year, Su Li's mood had rarely been so relaxed and happy. He lit 2 cigarettes. One was placed on the edge of Professor Shen's tombstone, while the other was held between his fingers. He slowly inhaled. Light blue smoke rose up in the late autumn cemetery, just like the fog in the mountains. Perhaps it was because of the smoke, but Su Li's eyes were somewhat sore. Very naturally, he thought back to the scene of the professor sitting on the ladder in the laboratory and smoking with him before his death. He looked at the black tombstone, and after a moment of silence, he said, "Professor, we succeeded." In the next few days or so, the Federation government would hold an official press conference to announce the development process of the MX Mecha. With the Federal Academy of Sciences' reputation in tatters, on the Shell Motor Company's little white flower mecha, in the history of the Federation, the soon-to-be-forgotten name of Shenyulan would definitely be remembered. The sound of footsteps suddenly rang out in the cemetery. Su Lu stood up and turned his head to look. He saw a white-haired old man, accompanied by several people, walking in his direction. Su Lu had only seen this old man's back from a distance at the entrance of that high-class hotel. However, from the countless photographs in books and magazines, as well as the scenes in the news, he quickly recognized the other's identity. He just didn't understand why this person would come to the cemetery. Lin Yuanhu slowly walked up to Professor Shen's tombstone and looked at the eternal sleeper in the grave. In just a few days' time, this leader of the Federation's academic community looked many years older. His entire person was like a withered tree, ready to fall at any moment in the autumn wind. "You're Su Lu, right?" "Yes. Tomorrow, I will resign from my position as the Dean of the Federal Academy of Science." The age spots on Lin Yuanhu's face were particularly obvious. Su Lu noticed this, but then he thought of Professor Shen's appearance before he died. After a moment of silence, he suddenly said, "Why did you come? Do you want to seek inner peace?" "I have been to this cemetery before." Lin Yuanhu gently coughed twice, stopping his entourage from coming forward. He said in an old voice, "I just hope to be able to obtain his or your forgiveness." Su Lu looked at him quietly. Shang Qiu had already described the scene in the command hall to him in detail. However, for some reason, when he saw Lin Yuanhu's calm expression of atonement, he felt a strong sense of discomfort in his heart. He stared into Lin Yuanhu's old eyes and said word by word, "Forgive? No, including you, I will not forgive a single one of them. Your performance doesn't mean that you are open and honest enough. You were just beaten down by the trap I planned for half a year. You had no other choice. In the end, you just wanted to play the role of a calm, atoning old man. A man who admits his mistakes. However, in the eyes of me and Professor Shen Underground, this is very disgusting." You're tuning in to the Li Mei's Wuxia Whispers YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.